She was 8 months pregnant, standing in floodwater up to her thighs, pounding on the door of the man who was supposed to love her, while he stood on the other side of the glass and watched her drown. That night, a woman lost everything she thought was real, and a man built from darkness made the one choice that would change both their lives forever. If you're watching this, stay until the end, drop a like, and comment the city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The hurricane hit Miami at 11:47 p.m. Not gradually, not with the slow theatrical buildup that the weather networks had been selling for 3 days straight. It came all at once, a wall of black air that swallowed the coastline whole and replaced everything familiar with noise and water and the kind of violence that doesn't apologize. Category 4. Wind speeds clocked at 142 miles per hour before the monitoring equipment on Biscayne Bay went silent and stopped reporting anything at all. Evelyn Mercer felt the first outer band hit while she was still behind the wheel of her car, sitting in the driveway of the Holloway estate with both hands gripping the steering wheel and going nowhere. She hadn't been able to make herself drive. That was the truth she wouldn't admit to anyone later. Not to the doctors, not to the investigators, not even to herself in the quiet moments. She had sat there in the driveway for 19 minutes before the storm forced the question, because some part of her still believed he would open the front door. He didn't. She got out of the car because the wind made staying inside it impossible. The door ripped from her grip the moment she cracked it, swung wide on its hinges, and she barely got her hand clear before it slammed back. Rain came sideways, not the kind of rain that falls, the kind that moves horizontally at speed and hits exposed skin like thrown gravel. She was soaked through in seconds. Her dress, the same dress she'd been wearing when he told her to get out, pale yellow cotton that had seemed fine that morning and now clung to her belly like a second skin, offered nothing against it. She was 34 weeks along. She climbed the front steps of the estate anyway. The security lights had cut out. The Holloway property sat on a private strip of waterfront in Coral Gables, 14,000 square feet of imported stone and custom glass. A house that had been featured in 3 different architecture magazines and cost more to maintain each month than most families earned in a year. She had lived there for 2 years and 4 months. She knew every room. She knew where the spare key used to be kept before Grant had the hiding spot removed last spring, citing security concerns. She knew the code to the front gate. She knew the specific pitch of the alarm that meant someone had entered through the east wing. She had known all of it, and now she was locked out of every bit of it. She knocked first. Then she knocked harder. Then she pressed the intercom button beside the front door and held it down and said his name into the speaker, her voice doing things she hated, cracking, going high, carrying the specific frequency of someone who is frightened and knows it and can't stop it from coming through. The intercom clicked on. She heard the static. She heard, underneath it, the quiet ambient sound of the house's interior. Climate control, soft music from somewhere. The ordinary sounds of a place insulated from the storm by 2 feet of reinforced concrete and impact-rated glass. Grant, she kept her hand on her stomach. Grant, open the door. He didn't say anything for a moment. When he did, his voice was flat and unhurried in a way that was worse than shouting would have been. The car is in the driveway. The storm. Take the car. I can barely walk, Grant. I'm 34 weeks. I want you off the property, Evelyn. She pressed her forehead against the door. The wind hit her from behind and she widened her stance to stay upright, one hand flat against the door, one hand on her belly. The stone beneath her feet was already wet. The driveway behind her had a 1/4 inch of standing water in the low spots. The storm surge advisory is a Category 4 evacuation zone. I can't drive in this. You know I can't drive in this. Another pause. That's not my problem. The baby isn't mine. Those 2 words. She had heard them before, 6 days ago, when he'd first said them, sitting across from her at the kitchen island with his coffee and his phone and his expression of studied calm like he'd been rehearsing. She had thought at the time that she'd absorbed the blow already. She had thought she'd processed what those words meant and where they were pointing and what came next. She had not. Hearing them again through a speaker in the dark, with the storm pulling at her hair and her dress and trying to drag her backward off the steps, they landed differently. They landed like something physical. She hit the door with her fist, just once. A flat, hard knock that hurt her hand and did nothing to the door. "Open this door." Silence from the intercom. "Grant, open the door." The intercom clicked off. She stood there for another 40 seconds. She counted them, not deliberately, but the way you count things when your brain is trying to find something to hold on to. The water on the steps was rising. The outer edges of the hurricane were making the palms along the driveway horizontal, their fronds stripped and whipping. Somewhere behind her, something large hit the perimeter fence and the impact sent a concussive shudder through the air. Then the lights inside the house moved, a shape behind the frosted glass panels beside the door. Grant, crossing the foyer, coming toward her. She felt something release in her chest. He passed the door without stopping and went to the window to her left, the tall, narrow one that looked out over the side garden. He looked at her through it. Eye contact. Deliberate, unambiguous eye contact that lasted 4 seconds. His face held nothing she recognized. Then he crossed back, disappeared down the hallway, and didn't return. What he did, instead, and she only understood this after the fact, when a housekeeper described it to investigators 8 weeks later, was to go to the second floor and retrieve the suitcase that had been packed for her. The wheeled carry-on she'd pulled from the closet herself on the afternoon he'd told her to leave. The one she'd filled with the things she could grab quickly. Documents, medications, the photograph of her mother, 2 changes of clothes. He retrieved it from the room where she'd left it and brought it to the east side of the house. And then he opened the side door, the one facing the garden that was already under 4 inches of water, and he threw the suitcase into it. She heard it. The side door alarm, then the splash. She came around the corner of the house in time to see the suitcase floating toward the garden wall, the zipper holding, the black shell already darkened by the rain. She went in after it without thinking. The water hit her calves and then her knees, and the cold of it punched the air from her lungs. She grabbed the suitcase handle and hauled it toward her and stood there in the rising floodwater of Grant Holloway's side garden, holding everything she had, and understood completely and finally that she was not going to be let back into that house. She understood something else, too. Something that arrived without drama, without the emotional freight she might have expected. She understood that whatever was happening, whatever had been happening for months, building toward this night, toward this specific abandonment in the middle of a specific storm, it was deliberate, designed. The timing wasn't bad luck or poor judgment. The timing was a choice. She got back to the driveway with the suitcase. The water there was at her ankles now. She looked at her car and she looked at the street beyond the gate and she made herself calculate. The gate code, the car, the nearest shelter, the distance, the wind speed, the state of the roads. She had her phone. She could call someone. She called her sister first. It went to voicemail after 2 rings, which meant the call was being declined rather than missed. She called twice more and got the same result. She called the number for a hotel she'd stayed at once before, a place in Brickell. The recording told her the hotel was closed for mandatory hurricane evacuation and to contact emergency services for shelter assistance. She called emergency services. She was on hold for 11 minutes before a recorded message told her that all non-emergency lines were at capacity and to visit a designated shelter location. The nearest shelter was 4.3 miles away. She looked at the flooded street and she thought about 4.3 miles, and she thought about her son. Because she'd known since the 20-week scan that it was a boy, although she hadn't told Grant, because she'd known even then that the information would be used against her somehow. And she made herself breathe. She pulled the suitcase to the sidewalk and she turned left because left felt less flooded than right, and she walked. She made it 2 blocks before the storm surge hit properly. The surge came as a sound before it was visible, a low, wide rushing that she felt in her feet through the pavement, a vibration that didn't belong to the wind. She turned toward the water and saw it coming down the boulevard, a brown churning mass of salt water and debris, moving fast and wide, carrying with it the detritus of everything it had already claimed. Lawn furniture, plastic bins, the door of a car, a child's bicycle, wheels still spinning. She ran, or she tried. At 34 weeks, running was a specific kind of desperate shuffling, her center of gravity completely changed, her pelvis aching with every step. The suitcase went first. She dropped it when she realized it was slowing her down, and she couldn't afford to be slowed down. And she moved up the street toward the higher ground of a bridge overpass she could see maybe 200 yards ahead. She didn't make it 200 yards. The leading edge of the surge caught her at the back of the knees, moving fast enough to drop her forward, and she went down hard on her hands. The water was already at her waist by the time she pushed herself back up. She got her footing and she kept moving, but the current was sideways to her direction of travel and strong in a way that was absolute. Not something to push against, but something that simply redirected you, like a hand on the back of the neck. Her feet went out from under her. She went down and the water was in her mouth, and she was moving, not sinking, moving laterally, carried by the current along the flooded boulevard. She got her head above water. She found the bottom with her feet for a half second before the next surge pulse lifted her again. She couldn't see the bridge anymore. She couldn't see the Holloway estate. She couldn't see anything except rain and dark water and the shapes of submerged vehicles. She grabbed a stop sign pole. Both hands, raw grip, her shoulder wrenched by the current. She held on. She held on for what felt like a very long time. And then ahead and to her left, light. Not the frantic motion-activated lights of an alarm, not the emergency pulse of something in distress. Steady amber light, the kind that comes from a property that has its own power generation and isn't apologizing for it. The light came from beyond a wall. Tall, old stone, Spanish colonial, set back from the street behind an iron gate that she could see was mounted with security cameras and topped with something that looked like black steel teeth. The gate was closed. She looked at it from the water. 20 feet, maybe 25. She calculated it the way she'd calculated everything tonight, as a matter of survival math, not hope. She let go of the pole. The current took her sideways for 10 feet before she found the bottom again and pushed against it, angling toward the gate. Her dress caught on something submerged and she felt it tear. She kept moving. Her hands found the iron bars of the gate and she pulled herself along them until she reached the intercom panel mounted at chest height. She pressed the call button and she didn't say anything eloquent or strategic. She pressed the call button and said loudly and without any particular grace, "Please, I'm pregnant. Please open the gate." Silence. Then the crackle of a live line. A man's voice. Deep, careful, and without the performance of concern. The voice of someone who'd learned long ago that emotions were a resource to be managed, not displayed. "How far along?" She blinked water from her eyes. 34 weeks. "Are you hurt?" She ran a quick internal inventory, hands cut from the pavement, shoulder pulled, water in her lungs, legs shaking from cold and effort, and the specific adrenalized terror of the last 20 minutes. "I don't know," she said, which was honest. A pause. Then, "Open the gate." She didn't know if that was directed at her or someone else. It didn't matter. The iron gate in front of her shuddered and began to move inward, and through it came 3 men in rain gear moving quickly, one of them already pulling off his jacket, and behind them, under the covered entrance of a building she couldn't yet fully see, stood a figure who wasn't wearing rain gear and wasn't hurrying. He was standing still. He was tall. Taller than she registered at first because the proportions of the entrance behind him made it hard to judge scale. Mid-40s, she would guess later, though he wore his age in the particular way of men whose lives had involved physical difficulty. Lean rather than soft. Economical in his stillness. Dark hair, cut close. His shirt was dry, which meant he'd been inside until just this moment. He had come out to see for himself. He looked at her the way very few people had ever looked at her, without assumption, without the quick scan for relevance that most people ran before deciding how much attention a person deserved. He just looked, and she had the unnerving sensation of being seen accurately. "Get her inside," he said. To the men, not to her, though it was not the statement of someone who expected her to object. "I need my suitcase," she said. It was a stupid thing to say. She knew it immediately. The suitcase was gone, carried 2 blocks away by floodwater, probably pinned under a vehicle or already out toward the bay. He didn't tell her the suitcase was gone. He said, "We'll find it," in a tone that didn't promise anything and didn't dismiss anything. Then one of his men was beside her with a jacket and a hand on her elbow that was firm without being forceful, and she let herself be guided through the gate. When it closed behind her, the noise of the storm didn't disappear. Nothing that thick could disappear. But it changed register, became something external, something happening out there rather than directly to her. She crossed the threshold of the property and didn't look back. The estate was nothing like what she'd expected, though she couldn't have said what she'd expected. The name Dominic Viscari occupied a specific category in the Miami subconscious, spoken low, in the way that names get spoken when the people using them aren't sure how far the sound travels. She had heard it at fundraisers Grant attended, in the pauses between sentences, in the careful way people looked at their drinks when they said it. She had heard it from Grant himself once, without context, just the name dropped into a conversation about waterfront property, and then never picked up again. She knew what the name meant. Broadly, imprecisely, the way everyone in Miami who paid any attention knew it. Old money that wasn't actually old. Connections that ran deeper than business. A last name that predated the current generation by more than she could trace. She hadn't expected the books. The room she was brought to, a sitting room adjacent to what appeared to be a medical annex, which itself seemed strange, though she was too tired to examine the strangeness, had 3 walls of shelves, floor to ceiling. History, mostly, and law, and a section that appeared to be engineering manuals. Not decorative. Cracked spines, post-it flags, the accumulated evidence of someone who actually read the things on his shelves. She sat on the couch they pointed her to and let a woman she didn't know, middle-aged, brisk, introducing herself only as the doctor, take her blood pressure and shine a light in her eyes and press careful fingers against her abdomen. "Any pain?" the doctor said. "My shoulder." "I mean here." The doctor's fingers pressed in a specific pattern. "No," Evelyn said. And then because the doctor's face did something when she said it. "What?" "Your pressure's elevated. That's normal for what you've just been through. I want to run blood work." "Is the baby?" "Heartbeat is strong. We'll monitor." The doctor was already moving, reaching for equipment that was present and organized in a way that suggested this room was not improvised. "You should know. There's a medical team here, fully equipped. You're not going to a hospital tonight, and that's probably fortunate because every hospital within 15 miles is running on emergency protocols." Evelyn looked at the room, at the equipment, at the calm and prepared quality of everything around her, which was the opposite of how normal people lived. "Where am I?" "Safe," the doctor said. "That's not what I asked." The doctor paused, syringe in hand. "No," she agreed. "It's not." Dominic Viscari did not come to see her that night. She learned this later and, oddly, respected it. He sent someone, a man named Carver, who didn't offer a last name and didn't seem to feel the absence of one, compact and gray-haired, and possessed of the specific patience of someone accustomed to waiting, to tell her that she was welcome to stay, that she was not expected to explain herself, and that she should sleep. She didn't sleep. She lay in the bed they'd given her and listened to the hurricane work through its second act against the walls of the estate, and she thought about the sequence of events that had deposited her here. The intercom at Grant's house, the walk, the surge, the gate. She thought about the way Grant had looked at her through that window. She thought about his words. "Isn't mine." Not, "I don't believe it's mine." Not, "I have doubts." Not the language of uncertainty, which would at least have been a position she could argue against. "Isn't mine." As if it were a fact already established, a matter already decided by some authority she hadn't been consulted about. When had he decided? She pressed her hand flat against her belly and felt the response of the child inside. A heel or an elbow, the particular pressure of a person trying to find more room. Her son, who was 34 weeks old and growing inside a body that had apparently become a crime scene before she'd understood there was any crime being committed, because that was the thought she couldn't escape, lying in a stranger's house while a storm dismantled the city outside. If Grant had decided, really decided, not in anger, but in calculation, then there had to be a reason. Grant Holloway didn't do things without reasons. It was the quality she had once found compelling about him, the sense that every move he made had been considered and found to be correct before he committed to it. If he'd decided the child wasn't his, and he knew perfectly well that wasn't true, whatever he chose to say about it, then he'd decided it because it was useful to him. It served some purpose. It pointed toward something. She lay there and followed that thread and didn't arrive anywhere definitive. But she felt the shape of it. Something large and not yet visible, the way you feel the presence of a ship before it emerges from fog. the displacement of water, the shadow arriving before the thing casting it. She finally fell asleep near dawn when the wind dropped briefly in the way of hurricanes that are reorganizing rather than relenting. Sad. She woke to sunlight that seemed impossible after the night before, pale and tentative, coming through storm shutters that someone had partially opened. The room was quiet. The estate was quiet. Outside, she could hear the particular sound of post-storm stillness, the absence of wind, which is louder than wind itself because you've grown so accustomed to the noise that the silence feels like something has been removed. Carver was in the hallway when she opened the door. Not waiting, exactly. Present, in the way of people who are very good at not appearing to wait. "Mr. Vescari would like to see you," Carver said. "When you're ready." "Now," she said. She needed a change of clothes and she didn't have one, so she smoothed the dress she'd slept in and told herself it didn't matter. It didn't. Dominic Vescari was in a room that was clearly his preferred working space, a study that faced the estate's interior courtyard through a wall of windows, the courtyard itself showing the debris of the storm, torn palm fronds, the scatter of outdoor furniture that had been stacked and weighted and moved anyway by the wind. He was at his desk and stood when she came in, which she hadn't expected, and indicated the chair across from him with a gesture that was neither warm nor cold. He looked different in daylight. Slightly older, she thought, and then revised. Not older, but more worn, the way some faces are that have been paying attention for a long time. He had dark eyes that held a specific quality she didn't have a word for in that moment. Something like patience that had been tested enough to know its own limits. "How are you feeling?" he said. "Like I walked 2 blocks through a hurricane," she said. "Better than I should." He nodded, once, which seemed to be his preferred unit of acknowledgement. "The doctor has your blood work." Something in the phrasing, "has your blood work," not as reviewing or ran some tests. She looked at him. "The results came back this morning," he said. He didn't look away from her. "I want to talk to you about something, and I need you to hear it before you react." "I generally react after people tell me things," she said. "That's how it works." For a fraction of a second, something moved through his expression. Not quite a smile. The ghost of one. Then it was gone. "There's a compound in your blood work," he said. "Pharmaceutical. It's been accumulating over time. Weeks, the doctor thinks, maybe months. Small doses, consistent intervals." He paused, giving her a moment that she refused to fill. "It's associated with premature labor. It doesn't cause it reliably enough to be predictable, but it increases the risk, consistently, over time." She heard the words, she assembled them in order. She found the sentence that lived underneath them. "Someone's been poisoning me," she said. He didn't soften it. "Yes." She looked at his desk. There was a coffee cup on it, a legal pad with handwriting she couldn't read from where she sat. A phone, face down. Normal objects, objects that people have on their desks in ordinary life. She looked at them because she needed something to look at while the thing he'd just told her rearranged itself in her understanding of everything that had happened in the last 8 months. The vitamins that Grant had started ordering for her online 6 months ago. He'd been particular about the brand, about the timing. He'd reminded her, twice a week, with uncanny regularity, whether she'd taken them. The specialist appointment he'd suggested 3 months ago. The doctor who wasn't her regular OB, whose office had been oddly reluctant to share records with her regular OB's office, whom she'd seen twice and then stopped seeing because she hadn't liked the way his staff had answered her questions. The specific quality of Grant's concern, which she had taken for involvement and now understood to be monitoring. "The baby," she said. "The doctor believes the exposure hasn't caused developmental damage," Dominic said. "But the risk of premature labor is still elevated. She wants to continue monitoring." Evelyn put both hands on her belly and breathed. "I want to find out where it came from," Dominic said. His voice was careful, not gentle, careful, which was different. Gentleness performs concern. Carefulness actually has some. "I have people who can do that. I won't do it without your permission." She looked up at him. "Why would you do anything?" she said. "You don't know me." He looked back at her without apology. "No," he said. "I don't." A pause. But someone opened a gate for you last night. That means something in my world. She thought about that, about what it meant in his world that a gate had opened, about what kind of world had rules around that. Yes, she said. Find out where it came from. He nodded, that single unit of acknowledgement. Then Carver appeared at the door with a tablet in his hand and an expression on his face that Evelyn was already beginning to learn meant that something had happened that needed Dominic's attention immediately. Dominic looked at Carver, and something passed between them that didn't involve words. "Excuse me," he said to her, and rose and went. She sat in the chair across from his empty desk and looked at the storm-stripped courtyard outside and thought about her husband and about the vitamins she'd taken every morning for 6 months and about what it meant that someone had been counting on her not to make it out of the hurricane. And she thought, if this was the attempt that had failed, what was the one before it? What was the one before that? Carver returned without Dominic and told her quietly that something had come up, that she should rest, that she was welcome to stay. "What came up?" she said. Carver looked at her with the expression of someone deciding how much to weigh the person in front of him. "Mr. Vescari's people found something," he said finally, "in the financial records associated with your husband." She waited. "He's not the only one who wanted you out of the picture," Carver said. "There are others, and they're considerably larger." Outside the window, a palm tree was missing half its fronds. What was left moved slightly in the light post-storm air. The city was beginning to make its first tentative sounds. A distant generator, a vehicle on a flooded street, the early inventory of everything that had been lost. Evelyn Mercer sat in Dominic Viscari's study, 8 months pregnant and alone in a stranger's house, and understood that the hurricane she'd survived last night was not the most dangerous thing coming toward her. Not even close. Carver's words stayed with Evelyn the rest of that morning, the way certain sentences do. Not loudly, not with the dramatic insistence of a revelation, but quietly. The way a sliver of glass works itself deeper into a palm with every movement of the hand. There are others, and they're considerably larger. She didn't ask him to elaborate. He wouldn't have, and she understood that without needing to test it. Whatever Dominic Viscari's organization was in the business of, discretion was structural to it. Not a courtesy extended, but a condition of operation. You didn't get information from Carver because Carver decided whether you needed it, and Carver's calculus on that question didn't involve her comfort. She went back to the room they'd given her, and she sat on the edge of the bed and she thought about who she was and what she had and what either of those things meant now. She was Evelyn Mercer by birth and Evelyn Holloway by marriage, though she had never fully inhabited the second name. Had always felt it sitting slightly wrong on her, the way a borrowed coat fits the silhouette but not the body underneath. She was 31 years old. She had a master's degree in finance from Wharton that she'd stopped using professionally when Grant had suggested, with the particular gentleness of men who have already decided that it might be better for both of them if she stepped back from her position at the asset management firm where she'd spent 4 years building something she was good at. She had a family trust. This was the fact that kept arriving, no matter what other thoughts she tried to hold. The Mercer family trust had been established by her grandfather 30 years before her birth and had grown, over the decades, through a combination of real estate holdings, investment positions, and the compounding patience of people who understood that money, properly managed, generates more money indefinitely. Her parents were both dead. Her father in a car accident when she was 12, her mother from illness when she was 26, which meant that Evelyn was the sole surviving heir, and the trust, which she had access to in partial distributions already, would transfer entirely to her upon her 35th birthday. 4 years from now. Unless she died first. She sat with that thought and turned it over and looked at it from the angle that Carver's words had just illuminated. If she died intestate, without a will updated since her marriage, the estate passed to her husband. Standard, legal, clean. Grant Holloway was a great many things, and none of them were incompetent. She got up and went to find the doctor. The medical annex was 2 rooms off the main corridor of the East Wing, and the doctor, whose name Evelyn finally extracted that morning, was Priya Okafor, though she gave it with the air of someone making a minor concession, was reviewing something on a laptop when Evelyn knocked on the open door. "I want to know everything," Evelyn said. About the compound. What it is. Where it comes from. How long it's been in my system. Dr. Okafor looked at her over the laptop. Sit down. I'd rather stand. I'd rather you sat. You're 34 weeks pregnant and your blood pressure was elevated this morning. Sit down. Evelyn sat. Dr. Okafor turned the laptop so Evelyn could see the screen. A clinical report, dense with terminology, highlighted in 2 colors. The compound is a synthetic prostaglandin analog. That means it mimics the hormones your body uses to initiate labor, but in concentrations too low to trigger anything immediately. What it does over time is keep your cervix in a state of low-level chemical priming. Like, you know how a fire starts easier in dry wood than wet? Yes. Your body has been the dry wood. Dr. Okafor said it without inflection, which was the correct way to say it. Facts without performance. Any additional stressor, physical trauma, severe dehydration, extreme exertion, and you'd have gone into labor, potentially weeks early. Last night would have done it, Dr. Okafor said. Almost certainly. 2 blocks through floodwater at 34 weeks, with your numbers? Yes. You'd have delivered. And the baby? At 34 weeks, outcomes are generally good with proper NICU support. Without it, she paused. In floodwater during a Category 4 hurricane, without a medical team? No. Evelyn put her hands in her lap. How long? She said. Based on the accumulation levels, I'd estimate 3 to 4 months of consistent exposure. Small doses. If you were taking them orally, you likely wouldn't have tasted anything distinctive. They're water-soluble, essentially flavorless. In vitamins, Evelyn said. Dr. Okafor looked at her. That would be a common delivery vehicle, yes. My husband ordered prenatal vitamins for me 6 months ago. He kept track of whether I took them. She heard herself saying it and felt the full architectural weight of Grant's care and attention over the last 6 months rearrange itself into something entirely different. Every reminder, every concerned question about her health, every gentle suggestion that she rest, that she not overdo it, that she let him take care of things. He was monitoring the dosage. I can't confirm that, Dr. Okafor said. What I can tell you is that the compound is not present in standard prenatal supplements. It would have to be added deliberately. Can you tell where it was manufactured? Not from blood work alone. You'd need the source material. The vitamins are at the house, Evelyn said, and then stopped, because the house was Grant's house and Grant was in it, and the idea of going back there to retrieve a bottle of vitamins as evidence of her own poisoning was so specifically absurd that it sat in her chest like a stone for a moment before it turned into something else, before it turned into anger, real anger, not the reactive, heat-of-the-moment kind that burns fast and leaves you empty, the slow kind, the kind that settles in and gets organized. Tell Mr. Viscari, she said. Tell him the source material is at the house. Dominic was in the courtyard when Carver found him, supervising the storm cleanup with the focused attention of a man who finds it easier to manage external disorder than to sit still with his own thoughts. He listened to Carver relay what Evelyn had said and stood for a moment looking at a torn section of awning that 2 of his men were struggling to fold. The Holloway estate, he said. Coral Gables waterfront. We have the address. Storm damage? Moderate. Navigable. He thought about the woman in his study that morning, the way she'd received the information about the compound. No hysterics, no immediate reaching for her phone. She'd gone still in the particular way of people who are already problem solvers by nature, who receive bad information by immediately converting it into data points and beginning to build a response. He'd seen that quality in maybe 5 people in his life, and in most of them it had eventually made them dangerous. She's going to want to be involved, Dominic said. Yes, Carver said. She's 34 weeks pregnant, and someone's been working on her for months. I know. Keep her here. He picked up a piece of palm frond from the ground and turned it in his hands without any particular purpose. Get Reyes and Torres on the house. I want the vitamins. I want any medication in that property. I want financial records if they're accessible without triggering anything. No confrontation with Holloway. Not yet. And if Holloway's people are watching the property, then Reyes and Torres will notice that. He dropped the palm frond. Go. She was watching from the second-floor window when the 2 men left. She'd heard the vehicle and positioned herself where she could see the gate without being seen from below. which was an instinct she hadn't known she possessed until this week. She watched the black SUV move through the gate and disappear, and felt the particular helplessness of a situation where the only productive thing she could do was wait for someone else to take action on her behalf. She hated it with a physical intensity that surprised her. She was still at the window when Dominic appeared in the courtyard below, looked up, and found her there. Neither of them moved for a moment. He didn't gesture for her to come down, or look away, or do anything to acknowledge the slight awkwardness of having been caught watching. He just looked, then went back to what he'd been doing. She left the window. Lunch was brought to her. She ate in the medical annex with Dr. Okafor, who turned out, under the clinical efficiency, to have a dark and very dry sense of humor that emerged in small quantities when her guard was down. They talked, cautiously at first, then with more traction, about the compound, about prenatal medicine, about what Evelyn's options looked like in the next 4 weeks before her due date. "You should stay here," Dr. Okafor said. It wasn't a medical directive, the way she said it. It was an opinion. "Whatever's happening outside, you don't want to be managing it while you're managing this." She indicated Evelyn's belly with a gesture. "I'm not someone who sits on the sideline," Evelyn said. "I know. I can see that." Dr. Okafor drank her coffee. "You can be involved without being exposed. Those aren't the same thing." "Dominic Vescari's doctor is giving me strategic advice," Evelyn said. Dominic Vescari's doctor is a woman who's seen what happens to people who confuse bravery with recklessness. She set down her coffee. "I've been with this organization for 9 years. I've seen brave people make themselves targets because they couldn't stand to be patient. Patient people tend to live longer." Evelyn thought about that. "How'd you end up here?" 9 years. Dr. Okafor looked at her steadily. "My hospital was going to lose funding. The clinic I'd built in Liberty City, 3,000 patients, people who had nowhere else to go. He funded it. In exchange, I consult when he needs a medical presence." She paused. "It's not a complicated story. Most of the real ones aren't." "Is he a good man?" "He's a precise man," Dr. Okafor said. "I'm not sure good and bad are the categories that apply." She picked up the coffee again. "He opened the gate for you. He didn't have to do that." Reyes and Torres came back at 3:47 p.m. Evelyn knew it because she heard the vehicle come through the gate and she heard the changed quality of the activity in the main corridor, the increased density of footsteps, voices in the lower registers that people use when they're reporting something significant. She came out of the medical annex and found Carver in the hallway and said, "Where?" And Carver, after a half-second calculation, said, "Study." She went to the study. Dominic was behind his desk. Reyes, late 30s, built like someone who'd spent years carrying heavy things professionally, a scar bisecting his left eyebrow, was standing with a sealed plastic bag on the desk in front of him. Inside the bag were 2 orange prescription bottles and a white supplement container that Evelyn recognized immediately, the vitamins. The label. The specific font Grant had shown her on his phone when he'd ordered them, saying he'd researched the brand, that they had excellent reviews. She looked at the bottles and said nothing. "The vitamins," Dominic said, "and these," he indicated the prescription bottles, "found in a locked bathroom cabinet in the master suite. Their prescription. The name on the label is a physician, Dr. Lawrence Cade. Practice in Betrayal." The name meant nothing to her. "Not my doctor." "No." He looked at Reyes, who took that as a signal. "Holloway wasn't in the house," Reyes said. "Looks like he left before the storm cleared. The housekeeper was there. She's the one who let us in. She said he had bags packed night before last." "He left before the storm ended," Evelyn said. "Yes, ma'am." She turned that over. Grant had packed before the storm hit. He'd sent her out into the hurricane with nowhere to go, and then he'd packed his bags and waited for the worst of it to pass and left, which meant he'd planned for an outcome in which she didn't survive the night. "He knew," she said. "He knew what would happen if I went into labor in floodwater." Nobody in the room disputed it. "What was in the prescription bottles?" she said. Dominic looked at her for a moment, measuring something. Then, "The same compound that's in your blood work, concentrated form. Enough for..." Dr. Okafor's estimate is 8 to 12 months of consistent dosing. He ordered 8 to 12 months. "Yes." She sat down. Not because she felt faint. She didn't. She felt the opposite of faint. She felt extremely and specifically awake. But because sitting was what you did when you needed to think, and thinking required stillness. He started this before I was pregnant, she said. Or shortly after, Dominic said. She looked at the prescription bottles in their sealed bag and thought about the math of it. She'd been pregnant for 34 weeks. She'd been taking the vitamins for approximately 26 weeks, based on when Grant had introduced them. The prescription had been filled for 8 to 12 months of supply, which meant either he'd started the plan before she conceived and had been waiting, or he'd begun it so early in the pregnancy that the distinction barely mattered. Either way, this had not been an impulse. This had not been a reaction to something she'd done or said or discovered. This had been a construction, built over time with patience and foresight by someone who had looked at her and her child and made a decision that their deaths were necessary and had then proceeded to work toward that outcome methodically. Grant Holloway had planned to kill her, had been in the process of killing her, slowly, for months, had watched her take the vitamins he'd selected and had tracked her health with the attention of someone monitoring an experiment. She understood, sitting in Dominic Viscari's study with that sealed plastic bag on the desk in front of her, that she did not know her husband at all, had never known him. Whatever she thought she'd seen in him, whatever she'd believed she understood about his nature and his motivations and the architecture of what they were to each other, it had been a surface, a constructed surface, maintained with considerable skill over the entire span of their relationship. "The doctor," she said. "Cade. I saw a specialist. 3 months ago, twice. Grant suggested him. Dominic was already looking at Reyes. Lawrence Cade. Find everything." Reyes left the room. "What else?" Evelyn said. She looked at Dominic directly. "Carver said last night there were others, larger. What does that mean?" He held her gaze. Whatever he'd been measuring, he seemed to arrive at a number. "Financial records. We pulled them from a secondary source. I won't explain the source. Grant Holloway has been in a business relationship for approximately 14 months with an entity called Northgate Biomedical Solutions, registered in Delaware, operational offices in Atlanta and Geneva. Medical, she said. Pharmaceutical development primarily, experimental compounds. They hold patents on several prostaglandin analogs. He let that sentence complete itself in the air between them. They also have a significant legal interest in the Mercer family trust. She went still. "Excuse me. A creditor claim filed 18 months ago through a shell entity. The claim was disputed by your trust administrators and hasn't been adjudicated. But if you were to die intestate, the claim would become significantly more actionable. And with Grant Holloway as your surviving spouse, they'd split it," she said. "Grant gets the estate. Northgate gets the trust through the creditor claim. They work this out together." "That's what the records suggest," she breathed. In through her nose, deliberately, the way Dr. Okafor had told her to earlier. Controlled breathing. "How big is Northgate?" "Large enough to have acquired 3 senators and a federal appellate judge over the past 6 years, Dominic said with a flatness that suggested this fact was professionally unremarkable to him. "The people involved aren't... They're not small problems. How big a problem are they for you?" He looked at her without blinking. "I'm not small either." "That's not an answer." "No," he agreed. "But it's what I have right now." Hosham. Torres found the financial transfer records that evening. Not Reyes, who was chasing Cade's license and prescription history, but Torres, who was younger and faster with financial data systems, working from a laptop at the kitchen table while Evelyn sat across from him and watched and asked questions he answered with surprising patience. What Torres found was a wire transfer, 14 months ago, from a subsidiary of Northgate Biomedical Solutions to an LLC registered in the name of one of Grant Holloway's cousins. The LLC had no other business activity. The transfer amount was $412,000. "That's the opening payment," Torres said. He had an accent she couldn't quite place, somewhere between Texas and somewhere further south. And he explained financial structures with the economy of someone who'd untangled a great many of them. 14 months, which puts it before the pregnancy. They weren't funding a response to the pregnancy. They were funding a plan they brought to him. They came to Grant, Evelyn said. Or he went to them. Hard to say from this end. Torres scrolled. There are 3 more transfers, smaller, more regular, monthly, started 7 months ago. A month before the vitamins. Monthly payments, she said, keeping him on schedule. That's what it looks like. She sat with that. Someone at Northgate, or multiple someones, had approached her husband with a proposal. Participate in the elimination of his wife and unborn child in exchange for a split of the resulting estate and trust assets. Grant had agreed. Grant had then spent the following months watching her grow his child while he collected monthly payments for engineering their deaths. I want to know who at Northgate, she said. Which people? Names. Working on it, Torres said. She looked at him. How long? Tonight, maybe. Maybe tomorrow morning. She nodded and went to stand by the kitchen window, looking out at the courtyard where the last of the storm debris was being cleared by floodlight. The estate was settling into its evening routine. She was beginning to feel the shape of it, the rhythms of a place that ran on precision. Guards cycling through positions, lights coming on in a specific sequence, Dominic's presence moving through the house in a pattern that she was starting to anticipate. Not by seeing him, but by the particular quality of attention that gathered in a room before he entered it. She heard him come in behind her and didn't turn around. Torres is good, she said. Yes, Dominic said. He poured himself coffee from the pot on the counter, black, no ceremony, and stood at the island. You should eat dinner. I'm not hungry. You're 34 weeks pregnant. Eat dinner. She turned around. He was looking at her with an expression that was neither warm nor cold, and that she was beginning to understand was simply his default. The face of a man who had organized himself around function a long time ago and found it served him better than anything more expressive. Why does it matter to you, she said. Genuinely, why does any of this matter to you? He drank his coffee, set the cup down. You were at my gate. That's not an answer either. No, he said, but it's honest. He looked at her directly. I have rules, not laws. Laws are something else. Rules. Things I decided at some point were the line between what I am and what I won't become. One of them is, you don't leave a pregnant woman in a flood. She waited. That's it, he said. That's the whole reason. She didn't believe that was the whole reason, but she believed it was the reason that had opened the gate, and she supposed that was sufficient. She sat down at the kitchen table, across from Torres, and accepted the plate that Carver appeared with from the direction of what she'd gathered was a very well-equipped kitchen. She ate. The call came at 11:14 p.m. She was in her room, not sleeping, lying in the dark with her hands on her belly, counting the movements of her son and running calculations she had no way to complete yet. She heard the change in the house, voices carrying urgency, a door opened and not closed carefully, the specific controlled rush of an organization responding to something unscheduled. She dressed and went to the corridor and found Carver moving fast enough that she had to step aside. What happened? He looked at her and made a decision. Dr. Cade, he said, the specialist. What about him? He's dead. Carver kept moving. Someone got to him in the last 2 hours. Before our people could. She stood in the corridor and held herself very still. Cade was dead. The doctor whose prescription had been used to poison her. The man who could have testified to who had ordered the compound, who had filled the prescription, who had administered it through what channel. He was gone. Which meant that whoever was behind this, Northgate, the executives, the people above Grant in the architecture of this conspiracy, they knew that Dominic had the prescription bottles. They knew his people had been to the house. They knew the chain of evidence was being assembled, and they had immediately, without hesitation, cut the link. They weren't waiting to see how this developed. They were already responding, already cutting. She thought about Torres at the kitchen table and the financial records and the names he was trying to find, and she thought about how long those names would remain attached to their owners once the people on the other side of this understood how close someone was getting. She went to the study. Dominic was on the phone, speaking in a low, rapid cadence that she couldn't hear the words of, but could read the register of controlled, but working to stay that way. He saw her come in and didn't stop the call, but held her gaze in a way that communicated that he knew she was there and would deal with her in a moment. She waited. When he ended the call, he set the phone down and looked at her and said, before she could speak, "I know." "They're watching your people," she said. "They were watching Cade. Whether that means they're watching my people, maybe." He stood up, moved to the window. "It changes the timeline. Torres needs to get those names tonight," she said. "Not tomorrow morning, tonight." "I know. And there's something else." She crossed her arms over her belly, an unconscious gesture that she didn't notice. "If they know you pulled the prescription bottles from the house, they know I'm here." She watched him. "They know you're involved." He turned from the window. The look on his face was not surprise. It was the look of someone confirming something they'd already calculated. "Yes. Which means this estate is now a target." "It's always been a target," he said, with a flatness that suggested this was simply the permanent condition of his life. "But yes, the nature of the targeting has changed." She looked at him. "I need to know what we're walking into. All of it. No more deciding what I can handle." He looked back at her for a long moment. Outside, she could hear the estate's security cycling, guard positions shifting, a vehicle moving at the perimeter, the sounds of a place tightening itself. "Northgate Biomedical Solutions has been running an illegal clinical trial," he said, "for 4 years, using wealthy pregnant women as unknowing test subjects for a range of synthetic compounds. The prostaglandin analog is one of them, the latest iteration. They've been refining the dosage. You're not the first woman who's been given it." He paused. "You're the first one whose case has been connected to a source." The air in the room changed quality. "Other women," she said, "we think 17, possibly more. Most of them suffered pregnancy complications they were told were natural. Some of them lost—" He stopped. "Say it." "Some of them lost their children." She stood in his study at 11 o'clock at night, 8 months pregnant, and felt something pass through her that wasn't grief and wasn't rage and wasn't fear but occupied the same physical space that those emotions would have, pressing against the inside of her chest like a held breath. 17 women. Possibly more. Told that what had happened to them was natural. Told that bodies fail, that these things happen, that— "The executives who authorized this," she said, "they're the ones who came to Grant. They needed a test case that would generate an estate asset simultaneously. Kill 2 birds." He said it without inflection. The clinical brutality of the phrasing matched the clinical brutality of what it described. "Your trust made you an attractive candidate. How long before Torres has names?" "I'm going to push him to 2 hours." She nodded. "I want to be there when he finds them." He looked at her. "I have a right to know who decided my child was expendable," she said. "Don't manage that away from me." A long beat. 2 hours, he said. "Stay in the medical annex until then. Okafor's there." She turned to go, got to the door. "Evelyn." She turned back. He was looking at her from across the room with something in his expression that she hadn't seen there before. Not warmth, not sentiment, but a specific quality of attention that was different from the calculated assessment he usually offered. Something personal, though she couldn't name the emotion underneath it. "What happened to those other women is not your fault." She held his gaze. "I know that," she said, but she didn't move for a moment because there was something in being told it by someone who meant it that she hadn't realized she'd needed until it arrived. Then she went. Torres got his first name at 1:03 a.m., his second at 1:47. His third, the name attached to the account that had initiated the original contact with Grant Holloway, the account that traced back through 4 shell entities to a specific board member of Northgate Biomedical Solutions, a man named Raymond Holt, who sat on 2 federal regulatory advisory panels and had been photographed 6 months ago receiving a public ethics award from a medical industry association. At 2:31 a.m., he was still verifying the 4th when the alarm went off. Not a single alarm. Every alarm simultaneously, perimeter, gate, motion sensors in the north and west approaches, all of them at once, which wasn't a malfunction, and everyone in the building knew it wasn't a malfunction. That specific pattern meant one thing: coordinated incursion from multiple entry points. Dominic's voice came through the estate's internal comm system at the same moment, clear and without panic, and telling Evelyn exactly 2 things before the connection cut out. Stay in the medical wing. Don't open the door for anyone but Carver." Outside, the first shots were fired, and Evelyn stood in the middle of the medical annex with Dr. Okafor's hand on her arm and felt the first contraction move through her body like a slow wave. Not painful yet, not the real thing yet, but unmistakable in the way that some physical sensations are, the body announcing something that cannot be negotiated with or postponed. "That's a contraction," Dr. Okafor said, her voice professionally flat in a way that barely contained what was underneath it. "I know," Evelyn said. Outside, the gunfire got closer. The contraction lasted 40 seconds. Evelyn counted them the way she'd counted everything this week. Not by choice, but by instinct, the brain reaching for numbers when narrative stops making sense. 40 seconds. Then the wave receded, left behind a dull ache at the base of her spine that she recognized from the prenatal book she'd read in another lifetime, back when her biggest logistical concern had been whether the nursery walls should be gray or green. Dr. Okafor had her hand on Evelyn's wrist and her eyes on her watch. Was that the first? Yes. Any tightening before it? Earlier tonight? Evelyn thought back. The study, Torres and the financial records, the hour in the medical annex waiting. Maybe. I thought it was stress. It was probably both. Dr. Okafor was already moving, pulling a monitor from the cabinet, setting up the portable fetal unit with the speed of someone who had rehearsed this exact sequence. "Get on the bed." "There are people shooting outside." "I know. Get on the bed." Outside the reinforced door of the medical annex, the gunfire had a specific geography. Coming from the northwest, which Evelyn had learned in the last 24 hours was the direction of the estate's vehicle entrance, the wider gate used for deliveries and staff access. Not the front gate, the vulnerable gate, the one that had fewer cameras and a shorter sight line from the guard post. Whoever had sent the men outside knew the property's layout. She got on the bed. Dr. Okafor attached the monitoring leads with efficient hands, and the machine began its read, the fetal heartbeat filling the room with its rapid, steady percussion, and Evelyn focused on that sound the way you focus on a fixed point when the room is moving. Her son's heartbeat, fast the way it always was, the quick flutter of a heart that had been building itself for 34 weeks and had no knowledge of compounds or conspiracies or the fact that people with money and patience had decided it should never get the chance to slow down into the rhythms of an actual life. "Strong," Dr. Okafor said, watching the readout. "Good," Evelyn said. A burst of gunfire, closer. The sound of it through the walls was muffled, but the concussive quality of it wasn't. She felt each report in her sternum, a physical percussion. Then shouting in the corridor outside, voices she recognized as belonging to Dominic's men, and then Carver's voice specifically, controlled but raised. "Northwest corridor, 2 down, 3rd holding at the junction." Then the door to the medical annex opened, and it wasn't Carver. It was a man she had never seen, mid-40s, dark tactical gear, a weapon in a low-carry position, and a face that wasn't aggressive, which was somehow worse than aggression because it meant this was professional rather than emotional. He looked at Evelyn on the bed, looked at Dr. Okafor beside her, and spoke into a radio at his collar. "Founder, medical wing, yeah." A pause, listening. "Understood." He lowered the radio and looked at Evelyn. "Mrs. Holloway, you need to come with me." "No," she said. He took a step into the room. Dr. Okafor moved in front of him, not heroically, not with any illusion about what a 53-year-old woman could do against a trained man with a weapon, but with the specific stubbornness of someone who had decided what the line was. "She's in active labor," Dr. Okafor said. "You move her now, and you risk—" The man raised his weapon and pointed it at Dr. Okafor and said, with complete calm, "Move." Dr. Okafor moved. Evelyn got off the bed. Her legs were steady, which surprised her. She'd expected fear to make them shake, and instead it had done the opposite, clarified everything, stripped it to its essentials. Her son's heartbeat on the monitor behind her, the man with the gun in front of her. The distance between those two facts was the only geography that mattered. She went to the door, and Carver came through it from the other side. What happened next took approximately 4 seconds, and left the man in tactical gear on the floor with his weapon in Carver's hand and a look on his face that suggested he had significantly miscalculated the threat level of a gray-haired man in a suit. Carver wasn't breathing hard. He looked at Evelyn, then at Dr. Okafor, then at the man on the floor, in that order of priority. "Are you hurt?" he said to Evelyn. "No, he knew where I was, Carver. They came directly to this room." Carver's expression didn't change, but something behind it did. She saw it, a fractional tightening around the eyes that wasn't surprise so much as confirmation, like he'd been holding a suspicion and it had just been validated. "I know," he said. "How?" He looked at her, and for the first time since she'd met him, Carver looked like he was calculating whether to tell the truth. He was holding the confiscated weapon at his side and looking at Evelyn Mercer with the expression of someone who is about to make a choice that cannot be unmade. "Come with me," he said. "Both of you. We need to move." The corridor outside was empty in the particular way of corridors after violence has moved through them, shell casings on the floor. A light fixture cracked. The smell of propellant in the air. Carver moved fast and Evelyn matched him, Dr. Okafor close behind. They went left at the junction, away from the northwest sector where the shooting had been densest, through a passage Evelyn hadn't known existed, a narrower hallway behind the main kitchen that ran toward the east wing. "There's a room," Carver said, moving. "Dominic uses it for... It's reinforced. Better than the medical annex." "Where is he?" Evelyn said. "Managing the northwest breach." "Is he... He's fine," said with conviction, not reassurance. "He's been in worse." She believed him, which itself felt strange. The readiness with which she trusted the word of a man whose last name she still didn't know, about the safety of a man she'd met 36 hours ago. The room Carver led them to was at the end of the east wing corridor, behind a door that looked like a wall panel, until Carver pressed a specific point on the molding and it swung inward. Inside, concrete walls, a generator in the corner running quietly, a table and 4 chairs, a weapons cabinet that was locked, another door on the far wall that probably connected to the estate's exterior. Emergency lighting overhead. The room smelled of concrete and machine oil and the layered time of a space that had been used for serious purposes. Carver sat them down, closed the door, stood in front of it. Evelyn looked at him. "Tell me how they knew what room I was in." He held her gaze for 3 seconds. Then he put the confiscated weapon on the table and said, "One of ours talked." The room went still. "Who?" Evelyn said. "I don't know yet. I know it's one of mine. The medical annex location isn't in any system Northgate could access externally. Someone told them." "How long have you known?" "Suspected. Since Cade died." He sat down across from her, which was the first time she'd seen him sit in her presence. "The timing was too fast. We pulled the prescription bottles at 3 in the afternoon. Cade was dead before 8. That's not Northgate reacting to a threat. That's someone inside telling them what we found and what Dominic was going to do with it." "And tonight they sent people directly to me," Evelyn said, "which means someone told them the storm compromised the perimeter. Someone told them which gate. Someone told them where I was sleeping." "Yes." She looked at the table. A crack ran through the concrete from one corner toward the middle, old, pale, the kind of crack that had been there long enough to become part of the character of the surface. "What does Dominic know?" "Everything I'm telling you. He's known since Cade." "Then why—" She stopped, reconstructed the logic of it. He kept it contained. He didn't tell his people he suspected a leak, because if the leak found out it was suspected, the leak would either run or tell Northgate that Dominic was onto them, and Northgate would have moved faster. Carver said nothing, which was confirmation. "He's been managing around a mole," she said. "For how long?" 3 days at most, since he got involved with your situation." Carver's voice was flat. "Which means either the mole was already in place and Northgate activated them when they found out Dominic had you, or someone was turned in the last 72 hours, bought or threatened." She thought about the names Torres had pulled. Raymond Holt. People with enough money to buy federal regulators and appellate judges. The idea that they couldn't buy one person inside Dominic Vescari's organization, given sufficient motivation and 72 hours to find the right pressure point, was not a comfortable assumption. "Torres?" she said. Carver looked at her sharply. He's the one who found the financial records, the names. If the mole found out what he had… Carver was already on his radio, a burst of words she half caught. A pause. A voice on the other end that wasn't Torres. Another pause. Longer. Carver lowered the radio. "Torres is in the kitchen," he said. "He's fine," she exhaled. "But his laptop is gone," Carver said. The shooting stopped at 2:58 a.m. She knew because the quality of the silence that replaced it was different from pre-shooting silence. Heavier, specific, carrying the aftermath of things that could not be undone. She and Dr. Okafor sat in the concrete room for another 20 minutes after the shooting stopped before Carver opened the door and led them out. Dominic was in the main corridor. She saw him and made a rapid unconscious inventory, standing, moving under his own power, a cut above his left ear that had been roughly dressed with gauze that was already showing pink, his shirt ruined, his expression doing the thing it did where it became more controlled the more significant the situation. He saw her and said, "You're all right." "Your ear," she said. "Fragment." He dismissed it with a slight movement of his head. "How far apart are the contractions?" "They stopped," Dr. Okafor said. "For now. The stress triggered early labor signals. She needs to stay calm and horizontal for the next several hours." Dominic looked at Evelyn. She looked back at him. The cut above his ear was deeper than the gauze was managing, and she had the odd, specific impulse to say something about it, to tell him to let Okafor look at it properly. And she didn't, because the corridor was full of his men, and this was not the moment. "Carver told me about the laptop," she said instead. "Torres has most of it memorized," Dominic said. "He's been pulling financial records for 4 years. Northgate isn't a new problem." He said it evenly, which meant he was more upset about it than the even tone suggested. She was learning to read the inversions in him. "We didn't lose everything. But they know we have Raymond Holt's name." "Yes." He looked at her steadily. "Which means Holt knows. And Holt will move to protect himself. He'll destroy evidence. He's probably already started." She thought about 17 women. Possibly more. Clinical records of an illegal trial that had been running for 4 years. If Holt had access to those records in 48 hours. "There's a federal contact," Dominic said, and there was something in the way he said it, a slight compression of his jaw, the expression of a man doing something he does not find comfortable. "Someone I've dealt with before. Clean. She's not interested in what I do. She's interested in what Northgate has done. If I give her what Torres has, she can move on the servers before Holt gets to them." "Can you trust her?" "I trust her self-interest. She's been building a case against Northgate's clinical division for 14 months. She doesn't have what we have." A pause. "I'm not in the habit of cooperating with federal investigators." "But you're going to." He looked at her directly. "For this?" "Yes." She held his gaze for a moment and felt the specific weight of that statement. Dominic Vescari, whose relationship with federal authority was by all available evidence adversarial and had been for decades, was going to hand over evidence to a federal investigator because 17 women had been poisoned and one of them was standing in his hallway. She didn't thank him for it. She didn't think he'd want her to. "The mole," she said. "Your people. We'll find them," said without drama and without doubt, which was more frightening than either. The interrogation happened at 4 a.m. She wasn't supposed to be there. Carver had taken her back to a room, not the original room, a different one, on the opposite side of the estate, and told her to rest, and she'd said yes, and waited 11 minutes after the door closed before she got up and went to find where they'd taken the man from the medical annex. She followed the specific quality of sound, voices in a register that suggested constraint rather than conversation, to a room near the estate's utilities section that smelled of industrial cleaning products and had a single overhead light and 2 of Dominic's men flanking the door. They looked at her when she appeared. They did not stop her from going in. The man from the medical annex was in a chair. He wasn't restrained in any way that was visible, which made the fact that he wasn't going anywhere more rather than less frightening. It implied that the constraint was fully internal, that he'd already made a calculation about the consequences of attempting to move and had decided against it. Dominic was standing across from him. Torres was in the corner with a phone and the expression of someone building a case. Dominic didn't turn when she came in. He knew she was there. The man in the chair looked at her and something moved through his face. Not regret, not apology. Recognition. He'd been sent here specifically for her, and seeing her in person rather than on a monitor or in a file or as an abstraction in a plan carried some meaning she couldn't fully interpret. "Who sent you?" Dominic said. He'd been saying it for a while, she could tell. The question had the rhythm of something repeated. The man said nothing. "Northgate sent you," Dominic said. "That's established. The phone we took from you has a contact number that traces to a switching station in Atlanta. Northgate's operational hub is in Atlanta." He said this without raising his voice, without threat in his tone, just the sequential presentation of facts. "I'm not asking you to confirm the organization. I'm asking you who specifically. Which name?" Silence. "Raymond Holt," Evelyn said. Both men looked at her, Dominic and the man in the chair. She stayed in the doorway and looked at the man who had pointed a gun at Dr. Okafor and told her to move. "Holt is the one who authorized the compound," she said. "He's the one who came to my husband. He's on 2 federal advisory panels, and he got an ethics award 6 months ago. His name is already in federal hands." This last part was not yet true, but would be by morning, and the distinction felt less important than the effect of saying it. Whatever you were told about how protected this operation is, it was true until about 4 hours ago. The man in the chair shifted his weight. "The women in the trial," she said. She moved into the room. "Did you know about them? When you took this job, did you know what Northgate had been doing for 4 years? He looked at her. His jaw was set in the specific way of someone who has decided not to speak, but his eyes were doing something that the set jaw was trying to compensate for. Something that looked, in the bad light of the single overhead bulb, like a man trying to wall off a room inside himself. "There were at least 17 women," she said, "probably more by now. Some of them lost their babies. They were told it was natural. They were told their bodies failed." She stopped in front of him. "I'm 34 weeks pregnant. My son has been being poisoned since before he was born. You came here tonight to... what? Take me somewhere? Make sure the job got finished?" The man looked at the floor between his feet. "Raymond Holt," she said. "Is he the one who sent you?" A long silence. Then, without looking up, "I want immunity." Dominic didn't move. "Federal immunity," the man said. "Full. In writing. Then I'll give you everything." Dominic looked at Evelyn. Evelyn looked at Dominic. Something passed between them that didn't involve words. A rapid exchange of assessments and conclusions that she registered physically, the way you register when 2 moving things narrowly avoid collision. "Get me your federal contact," she said to Dominic. "Now, tonight." The name they got from the man in the chair, who was named Marcus Webb, private security contractor, one of 4 men who'd come over the estate wall that night, the only one who hadn't been neutralized in the initial breach response, was not Raymond Holt. This was the first twist she hadn't seen coming. The name Webb gave them, with the flat cooperative affect of a man who has done his calculation and committed to his position, was Northgate's chief medical officer, a woman named Diane Ashworth, 61 years old, a physician by original training who had spent the last 20 years building what the industry called a regulatory affairs division and what Webb called, without inflection, a control network. Ashworth ran the illegal trial. Ashworth had designed the dosing protocols. Ashworth had selected the subjects, approved the compounds, and managed the evidence destruction when any individual case attracted too much attention. Holt was the business structure, the money, the creditor claims and the estate planning and the arrangement with Grant Holloway. Holt was real and criminal and would go down with everything Torres had built on him. But Ashworth was the architect, and Webb had one more thing to tell them. He said it looking at the floor, in the tone of someone delivering information they'd rather not possess. Diane Ashworth had a contact inside the estate. The mole he'd been working with tonight, the one who had told him where Evelyn was sleeping and which gate to use. He gave them a name. The name was Torres. Not yet. The silence in the room lasted 4 full seconds. Then Evelyn said no, which was not a refusal of the information, but a visceral first response, the word that comes before processing. She looked at Torres in the corner of the room. Torres, who had been at the kitchen table with his laptop for hours. Torres, who had built the financial case against Northgate. Torres, who had found Raymond Holt's name through 4 layers of shell entities. Torres, who had also lost his laptop in the breach and been conveniently unaccounted for during the 8 minutes between the first alarm and Carver's arrival at the medical annex. Torres, who had the most complete picture of what Dominic knew and when Dominic knew it of anyone in the estate. She watched Torres's face while Webb said his name, and what she saw was not the response of an innocent person being falsely accused. What she saw was a man whose expression collapsed inward in the specific way of people caught, not dramatically, not with the cinematically satisfying blow-up of guilt, but quietly, like a structure losing a load-bearing element, a settling. Dominic didn't shout. He didn't reach for anything. He looked at Torres and said, with a quietness that was not calm, but the compressed version of something that was the opposite of calm, "How long?" Torres looked at the floor. 8 months. 8 months. Before the pregnancy, before the vitamins, before any of this had begun. "They came to you," Dominic said. "Yes. And you—" "They had my brother." Torres's voice was flat, emptied. "My brother is in Barranquilla. He has a family. They told me, they showed me what they could do to his family." He stopped. "I thought it would be one job, information, that's all. Then it was another job, then another." "You knew what they were doing to her," Dominic said. The her was Evelyn, and Torres looked at her when Dominic said it, briefly, then looked away. "You knew about the compound." "Not at first. I found out." He stopped. "When?" Evelyn said. Torres closed his eyes. 4 months ago. 4 months ago, she had been 6 months pregnant. She had been taking the vitamins every morning. She had been growing her son inside a body that was being worked on, methodically and daily, by a pharmaceutical compound that Torres had known about for 4 months and had said nothing. She looked at Torres and felt something she couldn't name that occupied the same space as fury, but was quieter, more solid, the kind of thing that doesn't burn fast, the kind that lasts. "Your brother," she said. "Is he alive?" Torres blinked, looked at her, clearly hadn't expected the question. "Yes." "Then you had 4 months to figure something out," she said. 4 months to tell someone. 4 months during which I took vitamins every morning, and my son—" She stopped herself, breathed. "You were in this house. Dominic trusted you. You let them send men here tonight who pointed a gun at my doctor and came to take me somewhere." "I didn't know about tonight," Torres said. He said it desperately, and it might even have been true, and it made no difference. Dominic made a small gesture with his hand, and 2 men came into the room, and Torres went with them without resistance, which was the last coherent decision he seemed to be making. Evelyn stood in the room and breathed. The second contraction hit at 4:44 a.m., stronger than the first. She felt it starting in her lower back and moving forward, and she put her hand against the wall and breathed through it the way Dr. Okafor had shown her. Not fighting it, working with it, the body doing something that had its own timeline regardless of what was happening around it. Dominic was beside her before it peaked. He didn't touch her. He stood close enough that she could have reached for him if she'd needed to and waited for the wave to pass. When it did, she straightened and looked at him and said, "Ashworth, tell me about Ashworth. Evelyn, tell me. I'm not in labor yet and I need to know." He looked at her for a moment, and she saw something in his face that she was beginning to recognize, a specific kind of reluctance that wasn't protection so much as a man who didn't want to make something harder than it already was. "Ashworth has been anticipating a federal investigation for 8 months, he said. She built a contingency, a server archive, set not in Atlanta, somewhere else. The complete clinical trial records, 4 years of data, all the subjects, 17 names and possibly 40 more. Why would she archive that? That's evidence against her. Because it's also leverage. Against Holt. Against the board members who approved funding. Against the physicians who administered the compounds and the administrators who looked the other way. She has everything on everyone. It's a dead man's switch." Evelyn processed that. If she goes down, everyone goes with her. If she's taken without access to that archive, the information is automatically transmitted. She's made herself the keystone. Remove her and the whole structure collapses. But it collapses on everyone, including people she's made deals with, including people who are currently positioned to protect her. The federal judges, Evelyn said, the regulatory panel members. They're not going to let her be arrested cleanly. They have too much at stake. He paused. My federal contact needs that server location before Ashworth knows she's been compromised. If Ashworth triggers the archive early, as a threat, as a negotiating position, some of those files disappear, and some people use their positions to bury what remains, and 17 women never get their cases heard. She thought about that, about the structure of what Ashworth had built. Not just a crime, but a crime with a self-preservation mechanism that used the crime itself as its own shield. Elegant, in the way that truly malignant constructions sometimes are. Built by someone who had been doing this long enough to anticipate exactly how it might end, and to engineer an outcome that kept them viable even in failure. She doesn't know Torres gave her up, Evelyn said. Not yet. How long before she finds out? Dominic looked at his watch. It was 4:51 a.m. By morning. Once the men she sent tonight don't check in. Then we have 3 hours, he said. Maybe 4. She pressed her hand against her belly. Her son moved, a slow, enormous shift, repositioning the body of a child who had run out of room and was making the best of the space available. She thought about the server archive, about 40 names, about 4 years of women who had been told their bodies had failed them. She thought about Torres in whatever room Dominic's men had taken him to, and about a family in Barranquilla, and about the specific mechanism by which good people get turned into instruments of harm, not through ideology or malice, but through the oldest and most reliable lever, threaten what they love. She thought about Grant Holloway in whatever hotel room he'd retreated to after throwing her suitcase into the floodwater. Grant, who had taken a payment to participate in the death of his wife and child. Grant, who had watched her develop and grow, and had simultaneously been counting the calendar until the timing was right. Grant knows where the server is, she said. Dominic went still. Northgate needed him to understand the full value proposition, she said, working it through as she spoke. They needed him to understand why they were willing to pay what they were paying and wait as long as they were waiting. They would have told him enough to keep him invested, and Grant is meticulous. He would have verified what he was told. He would have found the server location independently as insurance. She looked at Dominic. He's the same kind of person Ashworth is. He builds contingencies. Dominic looked at her for a long moment, and she could see him reassembling his model of the situation around this new point. If we get Grant before Ashworth knows she's been compromised, Evelyn said, and if Grant has the server location, we can give it to the federal investigators before the archive triggers, Dominic said. Yes. Grant left the house before the storm cleared. We don't know where he is. I do, she said. She said it with a certainty she trusted completely. The way you trust knowledge that lives in your body rather than your mind. The accumulated intelligence of 2 years and 4 months in proximity to a specific person. He has a property, not in his name, not in any name connected to him. In his college roommate's name, a house in Key Biscayne. She gave him the address from memory, the address she'd found in a document 3 months ago when she'd been looking for something else, and had noted without understanding why she was noting it. He goes there when he needs to disappear. I've never been there. He doesn't know I know about it. Dominic looked at her. You've been sitting on that. I've been sitting on a lot of things, she said. I didn't know which ones mattered until now. He turned toward the door and she followed him, and he said, without turning around, You're staying here. I know, she said. He stopped, turned, looked at her with an expression she hadn't seen from him yet, something beneath the control, something that had been there for a while and was only now becoming legible. You know why I need you to stay. Because if you bring me and she goes into active labor in the field, it compromises because you matter, he said. Flat, without ceremony, the way he said everything that was true. You and the child. You matter, not as a witness, not as a source of information, as people. He held her gaze. Stay here. Let me bring you Grant Holloway. She looked at him. The fluorescent light overhead hummed. Somewhere in the estate a door closed. Her son moved again, heel or elbow, that specific interior pressure, and she put her hand on her belly and felt the third contraction beginning to build at the base of her spine. Slower this time, more deliberate. The body announcing with increasing clarity that it intended to do what it intended to do on its own schedule regardless of what any of them planned. "Go," she said. "Quickly." He went. And Evelyn Mercer stood alone in a room that smelled of concrete and the aftermath of other people's violence. 34 weeks pregnant, with a child that two separate criminal organizations had invested months in killing, and she felt the contraction build and peak and release. And in the silence that followed, she made herself a promise about what the world was going to look like once her son was in it. Not a vow, not a dramatic declaration. Just a quiet, specific, implacable decision about what she was going to spend the rest of her life making sure happened to the people who had decided her child was an acceptable cost of doing business. The decision settled in her like concrete setting. And outside, Dominic Vescari's vehicles moved through the pre-dawn streets of a city still counting its losses from the storm, heading toward a man in hiding who didn't yet know that the woman he'd tried to kill for 8 months had just become the most dangerous thing in the room. The fourth contraction came at 5:12 a.m. and lasted 53 seconds. Evelyn counted them lying on her back in the room Dr. Okafor had converted into a functional labor suite with the focused efficiency of someone who had worked in under-resourced environments before and knew how to build what she needed from what was available. The fetal monitor ran its steady percussion. The IV line in Evelyn's left arm delivered hydration, and a mild tocolytic that Dr. Okafor had explained with clinical honesty was not going to stop labor if labor had genuinely decided to begin. It was going to slow the process, buy time, give them hours rather than minutes. Whether they needed hours or minutes depended entirely on what was happening in Key Biscayne. "Stop doing the math," Dr. Okafor said without looking up from the monitor readout. She was seated beside the bed with the focused stillness of someone who has learned to conserve energy during the waiting phases. "I can't. Try." "Dominic has been gone 40 minutes, Evelyn said. "Key Biscayne is 20 minutes from here in light traffic. It's 5 in the morning. There's no traffic." "Then he's there." "Then why hasn't Carver heard anything?" Dr. Okafor looked at her. "Because Dominic doesn't narrate his operations. He executes them." A pause. "In 9 years, I've learned that the silence is usually the good sign. It's when people start sending frantic updates that things are going wrong." Evelyn looked at the ceiling and tried to accept this logic and found it only partially persuasive. She pressed her hand against her belly and felt her son shift. A long, slow movement, an elbow perhaps, tracing a path across the interior of her like someone reading a wall by touch. She had spent 9 months in intimate proximity to a person she had never met, a person who was entirely himself, entirely separate from her even while being entirely dependent on her. And in 5 weeks, or 5 days, or possibly 5 hours, that person was going to be outside her body in the world where people like Raymond Holt and Diane Ashworth operated. The thought had a specific quality of violence to it that had nothing to do with the contractions. She was going to need to make sure the world was different before he arrived in it. That was the promise she'd made herself in the concrete room, and it was still operating in her, steady and implacable, underneath the physical reality of what her body was currently doing. Her phone was on the bedside table. Carver had retrieved it from her original room, along with a change of clothes she hadn't yet put on. She picked it up. She had 3 missed calls from a number she didn't recognize and 1 from a number she recognized immediately and hadn't expected to see. Her sister. She stared at the name for a moment. Called back 2 nights ago, twice, declined both times, now calling at 5 a.m. She answered. "Evelyn." Her sister's voice, Dana, 4 years older, living in Atlanta, a fact that Evelyn's mind now attached to with sudden sharpened attention. Atlanta, where Northgate Biomedical's operational offices were. "Evelyn, I need you to listen to me." "I'm listening. Are you safe? Are you somewhere safe?" "Yes." "Why are you calling at 5 in the morning, Dana?" A pause. The specific quality of silence that precedes something that has been rehearsed. "I know about Grant. I know what he did. I know about Northgate. Evelyn sat up in the bed. Dr. Okafor put a hand on her shoulder and she ignored it. How? Because... Dana stopped, started again. Because someone came to me. 8 months ago, someone from Northgate. They told me about the trust, about what they were planning. They told me... Her voice did something unsteady. They said if I didn't cooperate, they'd find a way to include me in what was happening to you. Make it look like I was involved. I have kids, Evelyn. Marcus and Chloe. I have... What did they ask you to do? Evelyn said. Her voice was very level. She could feel Dr. Okafor watching her. Nothing at first, just confirm information. Whether you were taking the vitamins, whether you'd seen your regular doctor, small things. I told myself it was... Dana's voice broke. I told myself you'd be fine. That they wouldn't actually... You knew about the compound, Evelyn said, for 8 months. I didn't know what it was. I knew they were... Dana. She stopped her sister mid-sentence with the specific tone of someone who needs information without commentary. Why are you calling now? Because Ashworth called me an hour ago. She knows Northgate has been compromised. She's running. She told me. Dana's breathing was audible and rapid. She said if I didn't call you and get you to turn yourself into Northgate's people, she was going to release everything, including messages she has from me, including evidence she manufactured to make it look like I helped plan what happened to you. There it was. Ashworth's dead man's switch wasn't only a threat against the board members and the judges. It was a personal weapon, individually calibrated. She'd been building leverage against every person in the network, including the people who were connected to the targets through channels that didn't look like operational connections. Dana, her sister, connected to Evelyn by blood, by inheritance law, by the simple fact of being the person Evelyn would most want to protect. Ashworth had owned Dana for 8 months and was now activating her as a pressure point. Is everything she has on you manufactured? Evelyn said. Silence. Dana. Mostly, Dana said, very quietly. The early messages are real. The rest is... She added things, context that wasn't there. Made it look like more than, where is she? Not a question. A demand. She's leaving the country. She has a... Evelyn, she mentioned a charter. She's going to... Where is she leaving from? Opaloka, a private aviation facility north of the city. She said she had 2 hours. Evelyn looked at the time. 5:19 a.m. 2 hours from Ashworth's call to Dana put Ashworth's departure window at approximately 6 a.m. 41 minutes. Dana, she said, I need you to not call anyone else. Don't call anyone who has called you from Northgate. Don't answer calls you don't recognize. Can you do that? Yes, Evelyn, I'm sorry. I know. She ended the call. She swung her legs over the side of the bed, and Dr. Okafor said absolutely not in a tone that was the most emphatic thing Evelyn had heard from her. I need Carver, Evelyn said. You need to stay horizontal. Ashworth is running. She's leaving from Opaloka in 40 minutes. If she gets on that plane with the server access, she looked at Dr. Okafor directly. Everything ends. Every woman in that trial. Every piece of evidence. All of it goes with her or gets used as leverage and disappears into a negotiation that nobody wins. She stood up. I need Carver. Dr. Okafor looked at her for 3 full seconds. Then she picked up the radio from the table and called Carver herself. Carver took 11 seconds to absorb the information Evelyn gave him. She watched him process it the way he processed everything, without visible reaction, reorganizing internally while his expression stayed constant. Dominic is at the Key Biscayne property, he said. I can't reach him right now. They went in dark. You have other people. I have 4 men on the estate perimeter and 2 inside. That's enough for Opaloka? For an interception before she boards? Maybe. He was already moving. Maybe not. The aviation facility has its own security. If Ashworth has people there, she will. Evelyn followed him down the corridor. She's been running contingencies for 8 months. She won't go to an airfield without security. Carver stopped walking, turned to face her. You can't come. I'm not suggesting I come. I'm suggesting you call your federal contact. Dominic said she's been building a case against Northgate's clinical division for 14 months. If you tell her Ashworth is running, that she has the server archive, that she's leaving from Opalaka in, she checked the time, 38 minutes? The federal contact can have people there in 20. Carver looked at her. Dominic was going to call her anyway, Evelyn said. Call her now. Use what we have. Torres gave us Ashworth's name. Webb gave us the confirmation. That's enough for a federal intercept. Carver held her gaze for one more second, then pulled out his phone. At 5:31 a.m., in a waterfront rental property in Key Biscayne with impact windows and a private dock and no name on the mailbox, Dominic Viscari found Grant Holloway in the kitchen. Grant was dressed. Luggage by the door. 2 bags, quality leather, packed with the same meticulous attention to detail that characterized everything he did. He was making coffee when Dominic's men came through the doors simultaneously, front and rear, and the only reason Grant didn't run was that there was nowhere to run to. Reyes was already on the dock side, cutting off the water route, and the front was simply blocked. Grant looked at the men in his kitchen and looked at Dominic and performed, for approximately 2 seconds, the expression of a man who is considering whether to attempt something. His eyes moved across the room in the rapid calculation of someone assessing odds. Then the expression resolved into something else. Not surrender, but the pragmatic recognition of a losing position by a man who had always led with pragmatism. He sat down at the kitchen table. "You're Viscari," Grant said. "Yes." Dominic stood across the table from him. He didn't sit. "You already know why I'm here." "I can guess." Grant's voice was steady, which Dominic noted. Not a man whose composure broke easily under external pressure. The composure was structural, not performative. "Evelyn is alive." "Yes." "And she's been talking." "Extensively." Dominic looked at him with the specific attention of someone building an accurate picture of the person in front of them. Grant Holloway was better looking than his photographs, sharper, more physical than the tailored suit image suggested. He had the kind of face that inspired confidence, which was presumably a professional asset. "I want the server location." Grant looked at him without blinking. "What server?" "The Northgate archive, Ashworth's leverage file. You know what it is, and you know where it is." Dominic placed both hands flat on the table and leaned forward slightly. "You verified it yourself, 8 months ago, before you committed to this. Because you're the kind of man who verifies." Something moved through Grant's face, fractional, quickly controlled, the involuntary response of being read accurately by someone you've never met. "I want a deal," Grant said. "You're not in a position to negotiate. Everyone's in a position to negotiate. The question is what they have to offer." Grant's voice was even. "I have the server location, and I have something else." He reached slowly into his jacket pocket, the deliberate slowness of a man communicating that the movement is not a threat, and placed a USB drive on the table. 14 months of internal Northgate communications, every instruction Ashworth gave me in writing, every transfer record, every name of every person in the clinical trial. He left the drive on the table. "Backup copy, in case they tried to clean the archive." Dominic looked at the drive. "You kept records on them." "I kept records on everyone," Grant said. "Always." He looked up. "I want immunity. Full. In exchange for the server location, the drive, and full testimony against Ashworth, Holt, and every board member who signed off on the trial." "That's a federal decision?" "Then get me to a federal decision maker." His voice was still even, but something underneath it had shifted. A fracture, thin as a thread but audible. "I know what I did. I know what the exposure is." His jaw tightened. "Get me to a deal or everything on that drive stays on the drive." Dominic looked at him for a long moment. In the kitchen of a rental house in Key Biscayne, 5:30 in the morning, with the bay visible through the impact windows turning gray with the coming dawn, he looked at the man who had thrown his pregnant wife into a hurricane and made a calculation that had nothing to do with justice and everything to do with outcome. He picked up his phone and called Carver. "Was." The call came through at 5:38 a.m. Evelyn heard Carver's side of it, clipped, efficient, the compressed language of people transmitting critical information under time pressure. And she understood from the shape of the conversation that Dominic had Grant, and Grant was cooperating, and there was a drive. She understood also, from Carver's expression when he lowered the phone, that there was something else. "What?" she said. "The server location?" Carver looked at her. "It's not in Atlanta, it's not in Geneva." "Where?" "Miami," he said. "It's been here the whole time. Ashworth kept it local because she wanted physical access." He paused. "It's in a storage facility in Doral, climate-controlled unit, biometric access, registered under a holding company that doesn't connect to Northgate in any public record." He paused again. "The federal contacts people are 12 minutes from Opelika. They're going to intercept Ashworth, but the server—" "If Ashworth reaches the server before they reach her," Evelyn said. "Doral is 8 minutes from Opelika," Carver said. 8 minutes. If Ashworth had decided in the last hour to stop at the server before running, to trigger the archive manually, to burn everything as she left, to take the leverage with her in whatever form made her safest in whatever country she was running to, she could be there now. Carver's radio crackled, a voice she recognized as belonging to one of the men on the perimeter. Fast, controlled, something had happened at the gate. Carver raised the radio. "Report. Vehicle approaching, single occupant. She's—" A pause. The sound of movement. "She's requesting entry. Says she needs to speak to Vescari. Says it's about the server." Carver looked at Evelyn. "Who is it?" he said into the radio. The answer came back in 3 words that rearranged everything Evelyn thought she understood about the shape of this situation. "Says her name is Ashworth. Bassin." The 5th contraction hit Evelyn at 5:44 a.m. 60 seconds, stronger, the longest one yet. While Carver was managing the decision about whether to open the gate, and she breathed through it against the wall of the corridor with one hand flat on the plaster and Dr. Okafor's voice in her ear saying words she was registering without processing. When it passed, she straightened and said to Carver, "Open the gate." He looked at her. "She came here," Evelyn said. "Not to the airfield, not to the server, not out of the country. She came here, which means she's not running. She's negotiating." She wiped the sweat from her upper lip with the back of her hand. "She wants to talk to Dominic, and Dominic isn't here, so she's going to talk to me." "That is not happening," Dr. Okafor said. "It's happening," Evelyn said. "Open the gate, Carver." Carver looked at her for 3 seconds. Then he opened the gate. Diane Ashworth was smaller than Evelyn had imagined. 61 years old, silver hair cut short, wearing clothes that were expensive and understated in the way of people who stopped needing to demonstrate their status at some point and now dressed purely for function. She moved through the estate's entrance with the composure of someone who had calculated every possible outcome of this visit and made peace with the range of them. She looked at Evelyn and did not look surprised, which meant she'd known or expected that Evelyn would be the one in the room. They sat across from each other in the estate's main sitting room, Carver flanking the door with 2 men, Dr. Okafor in the corner with the specific alertness of someone monitoring 2 patients simultaneously. Ashworth had been searched, Carver's men, thorough, professional, and had submitted to the search with the calm of someone who had come unarmed because weapons weren't her method. "You know who I am," Ashworth said. It was not a question. "Yes," Evelyn said. "Then you know what I have." "The archive." "Yes." "I've already sent the trigger sequence to a timed relay. If I'm not at a specific terminal within—" She checked her watch with the practiced calm of someone who has rehearsed this moment. 90 minutes, the archive transmits. Everything, to every news organization on the list, to 3 federal oversight bodies, and to every person named in the files. "Including people you need to protect you," Evelyn said. Ashworth smiled. It was not a warm smile. It was the smile of someone who respects a competent adversary. "Including people who would prefer not to be named." "Yes." "So the trigger protects you?" "As long as I'm alive and out of custody and able to reach the terminal, yes." She held Evelyn's gaze. I want Vescari to call off his federal contact. I want the men he sent to Key Biscayne to release Grant. And I want passage. In exchange for what? The archive, the complete file, every record from every subject in the trial, usable, attributable, with chain of custody documentation. Evelyn looked at her. At the specific quality of Ashworth's composure, engineered, maintained, but underneath it, at the edges, something that was tired. Not afraid. Tired. The tiredness of someone who has been running a very complex machine for a very long time and has finally arrived at a point where the complexity exceeds the energy available to maintain it. You designed the compound, Evelyn said. Ashworth didn't blink. Yes. You selected the subjects. Yes. You knew what happened to the women in the trial who lost their pregnancies. The edges of Ashworth's composure moved, just slightly, just enough. Yes. And you built this archive as leverage, not because you felt remorse, because you understood that the records gave you power over everyone who knew. Correct. Evelyn looked at her for a long moment. At this woman who had built a machine for killing unborn children and had done it with the systematic patience of someone conducting legitimate research, and who had come to this estate at 5:40 in the morning, not because she felt anything about what she'd done, but because she was running out of runway and needed a deal. No, Evelyn said. Ashworth went still. No deal, Evelyn said. No passage. No call to the federal contact. She leaned forward slightly, both forearms on her knees, and looked at Diane Ashworth with the specific quality of attention she'd promised herself in the concrete room at 4 in the morning. Your trigger goes in 90 minutes. The archive transmits. Let it. You understand what that means, Ashworth said. Her voice had lost its composure layer. The first crack. The people who would be named, the judges, the... Let it transmit, Evelyn said. All of it. To every organization on your list. She held Ashworth's gaze. Because my federal contact, Dominic's contact, is already positioned. She's been building a case for 14 months. When your archive hits, she's going to be the first person to receive it, and she's going to be the best equipped to use it. She paused. You built your leverage assuming the people it threatened would protect you. But if they're all going down anyway, you have nothing. Ashworth's jaw tightened. And I have Grant's drive, Evelyn said. 14 months of communications between you and him. Every instruction in writing. You know he kept records because you would have done the same thing in his position. She watched Ashworth's face. Watched the calculation running. You came here because you thought you could trade. You can't. What you can do is decide whether you go to federal custody, cooperating or not cooperating, and choose accordingly. The room was very quiet. Outside, through the estate's walls, Miami was beginning its morning. Traffic, birds, the ordinary sounds of a city returning to function after the storm. The sun was coming up. Pale gold light was starting to collect in the courtyard that she could see through the window behind Ashworth's head. The same courtyard she'd crossed 2 nights ago, soaking wet, 8 months pregnant, led inside by men who didn't know her name. Ashworth looked at her for a very long time. Then she said, "Where is Vescari?" "Not here," Evelyn said. "When he gets back, I must..." "When he gets back," Evelyn said, "you'll be in federal custody, because Carver is calling the contact right now." She glanced at Carver. He was already on the phone. She looked back at Ashworth. "But I'm going to tell you something before that happens. The women in your trial, the ones who lost their children, the ones who were told their bodies failed, they're going to know the truth, every single one of them. Because whatever happens to you, the records exist, and the records are going to find the people they belong to." She held Ashworth's gaze and didn't look away. "That's the thing you built that's actually going to last." Ashworth's expression did something that was not remorse and was not defiance, something more complicated than either. The expression of someone who has just heard the full shape of their legacy described accurately and is feeling its weight for the first time. Then the 6th contraction came. And this one was different, not stronger in degree, but different in character. Deeper, more central, the kind that Dr. Okafor had described as the shift from prodromal to active, the body crossing a threshold that was not symbolic, but physiological and absolute. Evelyn felt it arrive and felt the difference immediately and looked at Dr. Okafor and saw Dr. Okafor already moving. "We need to go," Dr. Okafor said, to Evelyn, not to the room. Carver stepped forward and took Ashworth by the arm, and Ashworth went without resistance, and the room was reorganizing itself around two simultaneous urgent realities: a woman going into labor and a woman going into custody. When Dominic came through the front door, he saw Evelyn first. Rid her face, and Dr. Okafor's posture and the monitor leads that were still attached, and said, "Now," in a voice that was stripped of all the control he'd spent 40 years building. "Getting close," Dr. Okafor said. He crossed the room in 4 steps and was beside her, and she grabbed his arm. Not because she needed the physical support, but because he was the person who was there, and he'd been the person who was there for 2 days, and some things happen in the body before the mind has a chance to govern them. She grabbed his arm and felt the 6th contraction peak and breathed through it. And when it passed, she looked at him and said, "Did you get the server location from Grant?" "Yes." "Did you send it to—" "Already done. 20 minutes ago." His hand had come up to cover hers on his arm. He wasn't performing calm anymore. He was just present, which was different. "The federal contact has everything. Grant is in federal custody. Ashworth—" He registered Ashworth for the first time in Carver's grip by the door. Something moved through his expression, recognition, the rapid assembly of events he hadn't been present for. He looked at Evelyn. "You got her to come in." "She came on her own," Evelyn said. "I just told her the truth about what she'd built." He looked at her for a moment with the expression she'd first seen in his face in the early hours of this morning and still couldn't fully name. Not warmth, not admiration, but something that occupied the territory between them. Something that had been building for 48 hours in the specific pressure cooker of people who meet each other at the worst moment of each other's lives and discover, against all reasonable expectation, that they can stand in the same room and face the same direction. The 7th contraction arrived at 6:03 a.m. And this time, Dr. Okafor didn't say getting close. She said, "We need to move. Right now. He's coming." And somewhere across the city, in a federal holding facility where Grant Holloway was being processed, and in a vehicle where Diane Ashworth was being transported, and in the offices of a federal investigator who was opening a drive that contained 4 years of criminal history, the architecture of everything that had been built to kill Evelyn Mercer and her son began to come apart at every load-bearing joint simultaneously. And Evelyn Mercer walked, with Dominic's arm under hers and Dr. Okafor ahead of her, and the full weight of everything she'd survived pressing down, and the full force of everything she was moving toward pressing forward, into the medical wing where her son was waiting to be born into a world that was not yet safe but was becoming so. One collapsing criminal empire at a time. The federal building on Adams Street was the kind of structure that announced its own authority. Granite facade, brass fittings gone green at the edges, the particular weight of an institution that had been telling people what it was for long enough that it had stopped needing to try. At 12:47 in the morning, it was lit the way government buildings stayed lit when the people inside them needed to believe the machinery never slept. Mira parked 2 blocks east. Nobody had spoken for the last 6 minutes of the drive, which was not the silence of people with nothing to say, but the silence of people with too much, sorted into what mattered right now and what would have to wait. What mattered right now was narrow and specific. Julian Voss needed to be in front of a camera before Senator Carolyn Vash received any notification that the documentation upload had occurred. The journalist, a woman named Petra Hals, who worked for a national investigative outlet, and who Cassian had described as someone who had earned the 2 times he'd trusted her, was already moving. Cassian had reached her from the clean burner during the drive from Pullman, and she had asked 3 questions, received 3 answers, and said she could have a verified recording set up at a location of their choosing within 40 minutes. They had 31 minutes left of that window. "There's a problem," Julian said. Everyone looked at him. He was in the back seat between Alara and Wren, and he'd been quiet since he'd said Vosh's name, gathering himself in the way of a man who had been in a room for a long time and was recalibrating to a larger space. He looked like himself and not like himself simultaneously. Her father's face on someone who had lived 7 years inside circumstances she was still only partially understanding. "Vosh knows I exist as a risk," he said. "She's known since I entered the protection program. She's the reason my status was reclassified 14 months ago. She moved my file up the chain specifically to prevent Folds from accessing me as a witness. He looked at his hands. She also knows that I have one significant limitation as a source. I have no documentation. Everything I know is testimony. And testimony from a man who spent 7 years in a covert holding facility maintained by the organization he's testifying against. He stopped. A defense attorney dismantles that in 4 hours. Vosh knows that too. The car was very quiet. The drive, Alara said. The drive is documentation of Kessler's structure. It corroborates the Harlow Group's architecture. It does not name Vash. Julian looked at his daughter. I can name Vash, but my testimony alone without something that places her in direct contact with the structure. Mira, Cassian said. Mira was looking straight ahead through the windshield. Yes. 3 years of operating as her instrument inside my organization. Communications. Instructions. The method she used to pass directives. He paused. Do you have anything? A long silence. The kind that has something at the bottom of it. I have one thing, Mira said. I kept it because I knew the day would come when I'd need it more than she needed my compliance. She reached into the inside of her jacket. Everyone in the vehicle went still in the specific way of people who had watched her produce a weapon from a jacket earlier tonight. And what she removed was not a weapon. It was a phone. Old, a model 2 generations back, the screen cracked at the corner. A voicemail, she said, 14 months ago. She called me directly, broke her own protocol, which she never did, which is why I kept it. Something had alarmed her. She told me specifically to ensure that Fould's investigation was redirected away from the Wyoming shell structure. She held the phone. She used her name, her actual name. I think she thought she was calling a number that would be scrubbed. It wasn't. Alara looked at the phone, at Mira's face, at the phone again. That's everything, she said. That's the piece that connects her directly. It's a voicemail on an old phone, Mira said. It needs to be verified as her voice. Chain of custody is non-existent. A court would... Petra Halza doesn't need a court, Cassian said. She needs enough to publish. Courts come after publication. He looked at Mira. Can you testify to the context? When it was received, what preceded it, what followed? Yes. Then you're not staying with the vehicle. He held her gaze. You're coming in. Something moved across Mira Kane's face. Not relief. It was not as simple as relief. It was the specific expression of a person who has been carrying something very heavy for a very long time and has just been told they can set it down, which is not the same as setting it down, not yet, but is the moment before. My daughter, she said. I know people who can move faster than Vosh can reach, he said. Give Ren the name and the location. It happens in the next 20 minutes. Mira looked at Ren. He already had his tablet open. She gave him the information in a low voice. A name, a school, a neighborhood, a woman who was apparently a neighbor Mira trusted. And Ren began making calls before she finished. Petra Halse was 44, with the particular physical economy of someone who had spent 20 years in situations where drawing attention was a professional liability. She arrived at the location Cassian had specified, a law office 3 blocks from the federal building, belonging to an attorney Cassian had used on 2 occasions and who asked no questions that weren't strictly necessary, with a camera operator, a sound technician, and an expression of controlled urgency that said she understood exactly what she'd been handed and intended to handle it correctly. She looked at Julian Voss for approximately 5 seconds when she walked into the conference room. Then she looked at Cassian. Then she said to Julian, I need everything. I need it in order. I need you to speak slowly, and I need you to tell me specifically what you witnessed directly versus what you were told, because the distinction matters for what I can publish and when. She set a recorder on the table. And I need to know up front if there's any reason your account cannot be verified independently. The voicemail, Julian said. He looked at Mira, who set the old phone on the table between them. Petra looked at the phone, at Mira. Whose voice? Senator Carolyn Vash, Mira said. 14 months ago. I'll tell you the context before you play it. Petra sat down. Her camera operator positioned himself without being directed. Her sound technician clipped a microphone to Julian's collar with practiced efficiency. "Start from the beginning," Petra said. "We have time." They had 22 minutes before Petra said she had enough to begin verification. They had 38 minutes before her technical team confirmed the voicemail's audio signature matched publicly available recordings of Vosh's voice at a confidence level that Petra described, with professional flatness, as bulletproof. They had 51 minutes before Petra's editor in New York reached at 1:40 in the morning, told her to proceed. During those 51 minutes, Alara sat in the hallway outside the conference room on a chair that was not comfortable and watched her father through the glass partition. She watched him speak. She watched his hands on the table. Steady, she noted, steadier than she'd expected. The hands of a man who had been waiting for exactly this and had spent the waiting time maintaining himself against it. She watched the specific quality of his attention as Petra asked questions, present, precise, occasionally pausing to find the exact word rather than the approximate one. She watched him be the person he apparently had always been, in the life he'd had before the logistics company and the quiet, careful ordinary, and she understood that the thing she'd thought of as his withdrawal, his careful smallness, his deliberate not taking up of space, had not been timidity, had been the practiced invisibility of someone who understood that visibility was a liability he couldn't afford to pass to his daughter. He'd been protecting her from the shape of his life for her entire life. The understanding of it arrived not as a wound, but as something that would become a wound later, when she had the space to feel it properly. Right now it arrived as information, which was how she was still processing most things. Cassian came and stood beside her chair at the 20-minute mark. He didn't sit. He stood with his back against the wall beside her, arms crossed, looking at the conference room through the glass the same way she was. "Doyle," she said. "Reeves has him. He's out of their facility. He's functional." A pause. "He's angry, which is a good sign." "Marcus?" A longer pause. "Contained. Not by me. He ran far enough that he ran into people he shouldn't have run into. He's alive. He'll answer for what he did through channels I don't control." His voice was even. She heard what it cost him to make it even, and she didn't comment on it. That's how it should be. She looked at him, at his profile in the hallway light, the specific architecture of a face that had been built for one kind of life and was currently in the process of something she didn't have a clean word for. Not dismantling, not rebuilding, something more like a careful examination of the structure, conducted from the inside to determine what was load-bearing and what had just been weight. "Your father," he said. "He's good," she said. He's good." The repetition was not redundancy, it was emphasis, the specific emphasis of someone who had been told something 7 years ago with their body and had spent the intervening time living with a version of it and was now being required to revise that version entirely. "I meant, after this, what he needs." She looked back at the glass. "Time," she said, "and probably to be somewhere that isn't Chicago for a while. That's manageable." "You don't need to." "I know I don't need to." He said it without heat. Julian Voss pulled 4 men out of a building in Pilsen with no weapon and no stake in the outcome. What I need to do and what I owe are different calculations. She was quiet for a moment. "He won't accept it as a debt. He'll argue with you about it. Then I'll argue back. He's very stubborn. I've noticed. He's been in a room for 7 years and he came out of it speaking in complete sentences with a clear chain of evidence and a list of names in exact chronological order." He paused. Stubborn is the right word. She almost smiled. It surprised her, the almost smile. The specific surprise of the body doing something ordinary in an extraordinary moment, reminding her that the ordinary was still in there, still present, still waiting for the extraordinary to pass. At 2:17 in the morning, Derek Folds called the clean burner. Alara answered it. She'd been carrying the burner since Wren had given it to her, and she answered without hesitation, which felt like its own kind of arrival. The reflex of a woman who no longer let calls go to the wrong place. "The upload reached me at 11:48, Folds said. He had the voice of a man who had been awake for a long time and was awake more. "I've had my technical team on it for the last 2.5 hours. The documentation it's comprehensive. It's the cleanest financial trail I've seen built by a civilian source in 14 years of this work." A pause. I also received a call from a journalist 20 minutes ago who told me she has a recorded testimony and a voicemail that connects a named federal official to active interference in my investigation. Yes, Alar said. The named official. He stopped. I need to ask you directly, did you know before you called me? No, she said. I knew you had a leak. I didn't know how high. A long silence. There are going to be people who question my role in this. The investigation ran for 14 months without a break, and the break came from an outside source. That's going to require explanation. The explanation is that the structure was designed to prevent the break from coming from inside, she said. The explanation is that 14 months of your work built the context that made the outside source possible. Without your investigation, the documentation I have has no architecture to attach to. She paused. You've been doing the right thing in a compromised environment for over a year. That's the explanation. Another silence, shorter. I'm going to need you to come in. I know, not tonight. Ms. Voss Kessler, my name is Alara Voss, she said. I haven't been Kessler anything for approximately 6 hours. And I'll come in when my father has been seen by a doctor and when I've slept and when I've spoken to an attorney. She said it clearly, without apology. Tomorrow afternoon, I'll come in with documentation of my own regarding the circumstances of tonight, and I'll give you everything I know. But tonight I'm done. A pause. Then, unexpectedly, all right, he said, tomorrow afternoon. He ended the call. She sat with the burner in her hand and the hallway quiet around her and let the specific weight of, I'll come in tomorrow, settle into her. The weight of a future tense. The weight of there being a tomorrow in which she was a person making an appointment rather than a person running through a blizzard with a split lip and a cracked phone and no one to call. They moved Julian Voss to a hotel on the north side at 3 a.m, a room Wren booked under a name that didn't belong to anyone in the vehicle, paid cash. A room on the 4th floor with a window that looked out over a city that was still buried in white and very quiet. The storm had finally started to exhaust itself. The snow was lighter now, falling without the fury it had carried all night, and the streets below were empty and smooth to an almost formal stillness. A Dr. Cassian called arrived at 3:40. She was young, with a bag that suggested she made this kind of call regularly, and she examined Julian with the efficient thoroughness of someone accustomed to finding damage that had been sustained over a long period and was being presented for assessment for the first time. She said things in the specific clinical language of someone who had separated their feelings from their function. Malnourishment, mild, addressable, muscle atrophy, recoverable with time. Blood pressure elevated but not critically. No acute injuries requiring immediate intervention. She left a list of things he needed, and a prescription Wren went to fill immediately, and she accepted the cash Cassian gave her without comment and left as quietly as she'd arrived. Alara's ankle was looked at last. The doctor had tried to do it first in the triage of obvious damage, and Alara had redirected her to Julian. Now she sat on the edge of the second bed in the room while the doctor wrapped the ankle with a precision that was probably more than the ankle warranted and said it was a significant sprain, not a break, and that she had done notable damage to the surrounding tissue by walking on it the way she had for the last several hours. I know, Alara said. You should have. I know, she said again, without heat, just acknowledgement. The doctor left. Julian was in the other bed, upright against the headboard, watching his daughter. Cassian was near the window. The room was warm in the specific anonymous way of hotel rooms, and the light was the soft yellow of lamps rather than the cold institutional light of everywhere they'd been before. You sent it before you opened the door, Julian said. She looked at him. Yes. If you'd been wrong about the upload completing, I wasn't wrong. But if you had been, she looked at her wrapped ankle, then we'd have lost the drive and I'd have found another way. She looked up at him. There's always another way. I've spent 2 years finding out how many ways there are. He looked at her for a long moment with the specific attention of a man who has seen someone clearly for the first time after seeing them only in the version he'd carried in his memory. She understood what the revision felt like. She was doing it too, sitting in the same room as a father she'd filed under lost and was now required to refile under found, which was not a simpler category. I wanted to contact you, he said. When I understood the situation, when I understood that I couldn't come back, I wanted to find a way to tell you I was alive." He stopped. "I couldn't do it without putting you in exactly the position you ended up in anyway." "I know. I'm sorry." She looked at him steadily. "I know that too." She paused. "We have time to figure out what to do with all of it. We have time now." The specific weight of that again. Time, future tense, tomorrow afternoon. "That's enough for tonight." He closed his eyes. The exhaustion of 7 years was a visible thing, settling over him now that the adrenaline had finished its work. She watched him until his breathing changed and evened, and then she sat in the quiet of the room and let the night finish accumulating. Cassian was still at the window. She crossed to him carefully, favoring her right foot, and stood beside him and looked at what he was looking at. The street below, the snow, the early morning stillness of a city that would start moving again in a few hours, and would spend the next several days reading the news that was already being written in a Manhattan office building where Petra Halse and her editor were laying out the story with the specific care of people who understood what they were holding. The story would break at 6 a.m. Petra had told them before they left the law office. It would go simultaneously to print and digital and broadcast partners. By 7, it would be the only thing any news outlet in the country was talking about, because a sitting senator on the Intelligence Committee being named as the operational head of a multi-state criminal network with federal penetration at 2 levels was not a story that waited for context. It was the kind of story that cleared everything else off the table. By 8, Vosh's office would be issuing a denial that everyone would understand was not a denial. By the time Alara walked into Fould's office tomorrow afternoon, the denial would have collapsed. "Marcus," Cassian said. She looked at him. "I've been thinking about what I said in the car, that he'll answer through channels I don't control." He was still looking at the window. "That was the right thing to say. I don't know if it's the right thing." "What would the wrong thing be?" "I've known Marcus for 11 years, he said. "I built a significant portion of what I have with someone standing beside me who was selling it for the last 18 months of those 11 years. He paused. "The question of what that means about my judgment is not one I can answer tonight." "You trusted someone," she said. "The failure was his. My trust put Victor Kostova in a car that killed him." She was quiet for a moment. "Yes," she said. "Not as agreement, as acknowledgement. The thing that had happened was the thing that had happened, and there was no version of honest accounting in which it was otherwise. You couldn't have known what Marcus would do with what he was given." "I could have known sooner." "Yes," she said again. "Maybe." She looked at his profile. People who've been betrayed always find the point before the betrayal where they could have known. The point is always real. It doesn't mean the betrayal was your making. He looked at her then. The specific quality of his attention, full and deliberate, the attention he rationed. "You've had some practice with this." 3 years, she said. "That's different. It's the same mechanism." She held his gaze. "You loved what you thought they were. They used what you thought they were to get close enough to damage something you couldn't get back. You spent a long time afterward deciding whether the loving was the mistake." She paused. "It wasn't. The loving was just the loving. The mistake was theirs." He looked at her for a long time. The window behind him was going slightly gray at the edges. Not dawn yet, not close, but the particular quality of night that knows dawn is coming and starts making room. "What do you do?" he said. "After." "After what?" "After the thing that defined you for 3 years is finished. After the drive is uploaded and the story is written and Fould's has your testimony and Kessler is in a cell and Vosh's career is over." He paused. "What do you do with the space?" She thought about it. Not quickly. She let it be a real question, which it was. For 2 years she had been the woman with the drive. Before that she had been the woman inside the marriage, which she had been building toward escaping since year 1. Before that she had been someone else. Someone in the process of becoming who she was now, but not yet arrived, not yet tested to the specific temperature the last 3 years had tested her to. "I don't know yet," she said. "I think that's the point." She looked out the window at the city under its white covering. I spent a long time knowing exactly what I was moving toward. The drive, the contact, the documentation, the upload. Every step was the next step toward the specific thing. She paused. Now, I don't know the next step, and that's not the same as having nothing. It's having the space to find out. He nodded, small, deliberate, the nod of someone integrating something into the framework rather than agreeing with it. Mira's daughter, she said. You said you could move faster than Vash. She's safe. Ren confirmed it an hour ago. He paused. Mira knows. What happens to Mira? She cooperates with Folds. She has more on the structure above Harlow than anyone except your father. That cooperation buys her something. He paused. Whether it buys her enough, that's not my calculation. She saved us in the car. She also put a weapon on me in the car. After which she drove us to Pullman and gave Petra the voicemail that breaks the story. Ilara looked at him. I'm not saying the accounting is simple, I'm saying it's not simple in the other direction either. He was quiet. No, he said, it's not. They stood at the window in the warming quiet of the room, and behind them Julian Voss breathed the steady breath of genuine sleep, the first he'd had in a long time in a room with an unlocked door, and outside the snow fell lighter and lighter, until at some point Ilara realized it had stopped without her noticing the moment it stopped, that the storm had simply exhausted itself while she was looking at something else. The street below was still, clean and still, the way cities look in the specific hour before they remember themselves. Cassian, he looked at her. Thank you. She said it simply, which was the only way it could be said. Not for the rescue in the parking structure. They were past that. The night had accumulated too much on top of it to single out that moment. For all of it. For the 19 seconds of a voicemail he could have deleted. For the calculation he'd made in the back of an Escalade that hadn't been a calculation at all, but something else. Something older and less articulable than calculation. Something that had moved before his reasoning caught up with it. He held her gaze. You would have found another way, he said. Without me, you'd already built most of it. Probably, she said. She didn't say it to be modest. She said it because it was true, and because she understood that the thing she was thanking him for was not being necessary, was choosing to be present when he hadn't needed to be. That's not what I'm thanking you for. He looked at her, and she looked at him, and outside the window, the city was going from dark to the first gray suggestion of not dark, and the thing between them was not named and did not need to be named yet, was in the same category as what Ilara had said about the space after. Not nothing, not yet defined, present, and waiting for the room to find it. At 5:53 in the morning, Ren received a notification on his tablet. Fouds' office had executed a sealed warrant on Kessler Meridian Partners. Simultaneously, federal agents had arrived at a residence in Lincoln Park belonging to Senator Carolyn Vash, who had apparently been at that residence rather than the federal building, which meant she'd received some kind of alert and left the building at some point in the night. The agents had found her there. She had not resisted. She had made one phone call to an attorney and had said nothing else. Ren read the notification aloud to the room. Julian was awake by then, sitting up in the lamplight with a cup of the hotel coffee that Ilara had made badly, and he had drunk without complaint. He listened to the notification, set his coffee cup down on the nightstand, pressed his hands flat on his thighs, and was very still for a moment, the stillness of a man who has waited a very long time for a single sentence to be true and is now sitting in the room where it has become true, and is finding that the feeling of it is not what he'd imagined. Not relief, not triumph, something quieter and more complicated, something that would take longer than a morning to understand. Okay, he said, quietly, to no one in particular. Just, okay. The specific okay of something finished. Ilara looked at him. Her father, alive and in a hotel room in Chicago with bad coffee and an unlocked door and a future that was going to require significant and sustained work to build into something livable. Alive and stubbornly, exhaustingly, completely himself. She looked at Cassian, who was looking at Julian with the expression of a man completing a very long calculation and arriving at a result he could accept. She looked at Ren, who had closed his tablet and was sitting with his hands on top of it and looking at the middle distance with the expression of someone very young who has done something they will take a very long time to understand the full weight of and is not in a hurry to begin. Outside the window, Chicago was starting to find itself again. The first sounds of the city returning to itself after the storm, the low percussion of early traffic, the particular shift of light from gray to something that could honestly be called morning. Alara Voss stood in the warmth of a hotel room on the north side of a city that had tried to bury her the night before and had not managed it, and she breathed, and she let the morning happen. There was nothing left to run from. There was only the question of where to walk next, and for the first time in 3 years, that question felt like the beginning of something instead of the continuation of something she needed to survive. She picked up her father's coffee cup, which was empty. She made him another one badly and handed it to him, and he accepted it without comment, and outside the snow-washed window of an ordinary Chicago morning, the city moved on.